She wore 4 stars on her shoulder, carried battlefield scars, and still, it wasn't enough to protect her from the war waiting at home. At her own son's funeral, General Dana Mitchell, a decorated black veteran, was dragged through the dirt in handcuffs, not by enemies overseas, but by the very system she once swore to defend. What began as grief unraveled into a terrifying revelation of systemic racism embedded in law enforcement and power. Humiliated in uniform, silenced in court, and betrayed by those in office, Dana faced a question no soldier should. What justice remains for those who served when the battle is at their doorstep? And what happens when a mother turns her pain into a reckoning? Tell us where you're watching from, and watch to the end for the shocking ending. A general held at gunpoint at her own son's funeral. What kind of country allows that? The sun glared off the marble headstones of Arlington Heights Military Cemetery, casting long, solemn shadows across the perfectly trimmed lawn. Rows upon rows of white stones stood at attention like soldiers still guarding their nation in silence. The air was hushed, reverent, every breath held in grief, in respect, in disbelief. It was a funeral reserved for the highest honors a decorated captain laid to rest under the watchful eye of a nation that had once promised justice and equality to all who served. But that promise was already breaking. At the center of it all stood General Dana Mitchell. 4 stars on her shoulder, a chest of medals that told the story of 3 wars, 15 deployments, and a lifetime spent defending a flag that had not always defended her. She wore her dress uniform like armor, but it could not shield her from what was coming. In her hands was a folded American flag, the one given to mothers when sons die too young in places too far from home. Her jaw was clenched, her back was straight, her eyes glassy but unflinching. Standing just feet away was Officer Rick Talbot, a local cop in crisp uniform, white, stocky, eyes cold as the steel in his holstered weapon, but today that weapon was no longer at his hip. It was in his hand, and it was pointed squarely at the temple of General Mitchell. The crowd was frozen. Hundreds of mourners, from high-ranking generals to foot soldiers, from grieving neighbors to news reporters with cameras still rolling, stood in suspended horror. Dana didn't flinch, not when he shouted at her, not when he barked orders, not even when he stepped forward, pressing the barrel to her skin with enough force to draw a drop of blood that slid down and stained her Medal of Honor. "This one thinks she's untouchable," Talbot growled. His voice was picked up by 6 microphones. Time she learned her place. No one moved, not the officers flanking him, not the 20-man police detail surrounding the perimeter, every one of them silent, complicit, their badges catching the same sun that shimmered off Dana's stars. Not even the soldiers in uniform, caught between training and shock, loyalty and outrage, and Dana. She didn't look away, she didn't cry, she didn't beg. She whispered, low and firm, "Not today," and she reached, slowly, deliberately, her hand extended, not for a weapon, but for the folded flag resting on its velvet cushion, her son's flag, the last thing she would ever hold of him. Her fingers brushed its edge. That's when the shot rang out. The sound cracked across the cemetery like lightning splitting a tree. Some screamed, others ducked. Cameras snapped to attention, capturing the chaos in real time, but the shot didn't come from Dana's hand. She never had a weapon. The shot came from behind, from Officer Brent Wilson Talbot's partner firing into the air to cause confusion, to justify what would follow. In the frenzy, Talbot tackled Dana to the ground. Her son's flag tumbled from her grip and landed in the dirt beside his grave. The woman who had served her country longer than most had been alive was face down in the soil, a knee on her spine, her wrists wrenched behind her back. "You're under arrest," Talbot barked. "Assaulting an officer." Reaching for a weapon in a restricted zone, no weapon was ever found. No threat ever existed, but the lie had already taken form, and in front of every camera, every mourner, and every American watching from home. General Dana Mitchell, the highest-ranking black woman in the history of the U.S. military, was dragged away in handcuffs. Her father, Walter Mitchell, a veteran with legs that could barely hold his own weight, tried to reach her, but he was shoved back. Her daughter, Erin, a civil rights attorney, screamed her name as officers blocked her path, and the soldiers who had fought beside her son, men and women of every race, closed ranks but did not advance because if they had, they knew, more guns would be drawn. And still, no one moved to stop it. But this story doesn't begin at the cemetery. It doesn't begin with a gun, or even with a grave. It begins 3 days earlier, at a security checkpoint in Houston International Airport, where a mother arrived. Not as a target, but simply as a woman returning home to bury her child. The wheels hit the runway with a gentle thud, and the jet slowed its descent into the hazy afternoon heat of Houston. From her window seat in row 3A, General Dana Mitchell watched the city stretch out beneath the clouds, a skyline both familiar and impossibly distant. The sun flared off glass towers and highways that crisscrossed the land she once called home. It should have been a homecoming, but nothing felt like home anymore. Her posture remained upright, unwavering, even in the narrow seat. She had long mastered the art of appearing composed in confined spaces, helicopters in Kabul, bunkers in Mosul, back rooms at the Pentagon. But this was different. This wasn't a war zone. This wasn't a mission. This was grief. And no amount of training could armor a mother against the burial of her only son. The flight attendant walked by, slowing slightly when she passed Dana's seat. "General Mitchell," she said quietly, almost reverently, "thank you for your service. We're honored to have you on board." Dana nodded. She was used to the tone, the hush of awe, the hesitance in voices when people said her rank aloud, as if still surprised that it belonged to a black woman. She'd been the first in so many places, earned every star through a minefield of doubt and politics. But none of it prepared her for this. Not the medals, not the citations, not the congressional commendations. Her son was dead, Captain Drew Mitchell, 32, Afghanistan, killed in action. No briefing had ever taught her how to bury a child. The seatbelt sign chimed off. Passengers began to collect their things, stretch stiff legs, and mumble travel plans. Dana reached up to retrieve her single carry-on. Inside her dress uniform folded in precision, a photo of Drew in his combat gear, a flag not yet handed to her. The silence in her head was louder than the announcements playing overhead. As she walked through the terminal, conversations quieted around her. Some turned their heads, others nudged children. A man placed his hand over his heart, but Dana barely noticed. She had mastered that, too, walking through reverence as if it were fog. What caught her attention was a girl, no older than 8, standing just past Gate 27 with her parents. The girl's eyes lit up when she saw Dana. She whispered something to her mother, who smiled nervously and urged her forward. The child stepped close, holding out a napkin and a marker. "Are you a real general?" she asked. Her voice trembled between curiosity and awe. Dana looked down at her, then at the napkin. She took the marker, crouched slightly, and signed her name in bold, deliberate strokes. "Yes, sweetheart," she answered. "I am." The girl's father beamed. "We told her about you after she learned about the military in school. Didn't expect to actually meet one." Dana smiled, just slightly. "It's an honor," she said, handing the napkin back. "Your daughter's brave to ask." They exchanged a few more words, and then Dana moved on, her boots clicking against polished floors. The airport buzzed as usual, but she walked as if in a different dimension, one where time moves slower and the weight on her back was heavier than her pack in Kandahar ever was. Every step was a step closer to a funeral. Every breath a countdown to seeing Drew's flag-draped coffin. She adjusted her collar, felt the edge of her rank insignia. Her uniform had protected her in war zones across the globe. It had earned her a seat at the table in rooms where no one looked like her. It had shielded her from doubt, from erasure, from being passed over. It had been her second skin, her badge of survival. But as she approached the security checkpoint ahead, a strange discomfort settled in her chest. It wasn't fear, it wasn't anger, it was knowing. Because Dana Mitchell had lived long enough and served high enough to understand something fundamental about her country. Her uniform earned her respect on 3 continents, but it wouldn't protect her on her own. And waiting ahead at the metal detector marked Zone C was a man with cold eyes and a badge of his own, Officer Rick Talbot. He didn't salute. He didn't nod. He didn't even glance up when she stepped forward. He just said, "Random screening. Step aside, please." Dana blinked once, then looked him in the eye. Calm, professional, still carrying the grief of a mother, the bearing of a general. She didn't know it yet, but this man had been waiting for her, watching, and what happened next wouldn't be random at all. The line at the security checkpoint moved with the usual rhythm, shoes off, bags in bins, small talk lost in the buzz of conveyor belts and overhead announcements. But when General Dana Mitchell stepped into the screening area, time didn't slow, it snapped. Every movement, every glance, every silence suddenly meant something more. Officer Rick Talbot stood just past the scanner, arms crossed, eyes locked on her like a predator identifying its mark. He didn't blink when she approached. He didn't greet her, didn't acknowledge the rank on her chest or the solemnity written across her face. He simply stepped forward and said the words that changed everything. "Ma'am, we're flagging you for a secondary screening. Step over here, please." Dana looked at him, calm but steady. "I'm on a time-sensitive military itinerary. I've already cleared federal security on my connection. Here are my credentials." She handed him her Department of Defense orders and military identification. Her voice remained level, every syllable clipped with the discipline of 3 decades in uniform. But Talbot didn't even glance at the documents. He held them in his hand, studied her face instead. "This says you're a lieutenant general," he said flatly. "I am," Dana replied. He tilted his head, eyes narrowing. "You don't look like a general." The words hit harder than he likely intended, or maybe exactly as he intended. Dana's lips tightened, but she said nothing. She had heard versions of this her entire career, in conference rooms, on battlefields, even at award ceremonies. Black, female, commanding. To men like Talbot, it was an equation that never computed. She knew better than to feed his ignorance with indignation, but the shame didn't belong to her. Not today. Not ever. "I'd like you to step into the inspection area," he said, motioning toward a side corridor. "Remove your jacket. We'll need to examine it separately." Her jacket. The one bearing her ribbons, her stars, her unit insignias, her history. He wanted her to take it off in public, in front of the growing crowd of passengers, cameras, and whispers. She hesitated, not out of defiance, but out of awareness of the optics, of the humiliation he was staging. She removed the jacket slowly, folded it with care, and handed it to him. "What exactly are you looking for?" Officer Talbot took the jacket and smirked. "Just doing my job. Some people fake these things. Uniform theft's a real issue these days." Dana's jaw locked. "Those medals aren't for show. I earned every one of them." He held the folded jacket like it was contaminated. "I'll be the judge of that." By now, the murmurs had begun. Other travelers watched in stiff discomfort. Some averted their eyes. A few reached for phones but stopped short. "That's how it works," she thought. Not with screaming or sirens, but with calculated humiliation, administered slowly and wrapped in procedure. Behind the barricade, a voice rose sharply. "Is there a problem here?" It was Erin Mitchell Dana's daughter, civil rights attorney, fierce, focused. She had just arrived to pick up her mother, her expression turning from relief to outrage the moment she saw the scene. "Ma'am, you need to step back," Talbot barked. "I'm her legal counsel," Erin replied, "and I'm telling you, unless you have probable cause, what you're doing is unconstitutional. That's a U.S. Army 4-star general you're harassing." Talbot didn't blink. "If you don't remove yourself from the screening area, I'll have to detain you for obstruction." Erin's nostrils flared. Dana raised a hand slightly, barely a gesture, but enough to still her daughter's protest. "I'm fine," she said. "Not comfortable, but fine." Talbot wasn't done. For the next 2 hours, he extended the inspection beyond anything reasonable. He demanded verification of documents that were already verified. He asked probing questions about Dana's background, her service record, even her son's death. He never raised his voice, never cursed, but each request was laced with the same venom: prove you belong. Prove you're not a fraud. Dana stood through all of it, not with passivity, but with defiance rooted in dignity. She was used to inspections, but this wasn't about security. This was about erasure, about reducing her to something less than she was less than her rank, her experience, her humanity. And that kind of reduction is not loud. It's quiet. It's wrapped in protocol. It wears a badge and a uniform, but it does not serve justice. Eventually, the screening ended. Without an apology, without acknowledgement, Talbot handed back her jacket, his fingers brushing the Medal of Honor pinned above her heart. "You're clear," he said. Dana took the jacket, slipped it back on with the precision of a soldier preparing for inspection. She didn't thank him. She didn't nod. She just turned and walked. Erin walked beside her, fury radiating off every step. "We need to file a complaint," she said. "That was racial profiling, abuse of authority, intimidation. He broke so many regulations I lost count." Dana kept walking. "Not yet," she said. "Why not?" "Because right now we have a funeral to plan." They exited the terminal in silence, Dana's back straight, Erin's fists clenched. Neither of them noticed Officer Rick Talbot watching them from behind the security glass. His eyes followed Dana until she vanished from view. Then, with the ease of routine, he reached for his personal phone, dialed, and spoke just 3 words. "Target confirmed. She's here." The sun was beginning to set by the time Dana and Aaron pulled into the narrow driveway of the Mitchell family home in Houston's 3rd Ward. The street was lined with aging oaks, their branches casting long shadows over faded porches and weathered fences. This neighborhood had seen decades of change, both progress and pain. But this house, nestled beneath the same American flag Dana had helped her father hang 20 years ago, remained untouched. It was where Dana grew up. It was where she raised her own children. And now, it was where she would mourn one of them. The moment she stepped inside, the air changed. The scent of old wood and lemon polish wrapped around her like a memory. The photos on the wall hadn't moved since the last time Drew visited portraits of him in uniform. Snapshots of him as a boy on the porch with a water gun and a grin wide enough to split the sky. Dana's eyes paused on one image, in particular Drew at West Point, shaking hands with his commanding officer. Pride swelled in her chest, but grief pressed against it like a tide. Walter Mitchell was already waiting for her in the kitchen, sitting at the small oak table that had anchored the family through hurricanes, homecomings, and heartbreak. His cane leaned against his chair, and his gaze, still sharp despite age and war, locked onto his daughter the second she stepped into the room. "They told me it was enemy fire," he said without preamble. His voice was low, almost a growl, but I don't believe it. Not for 1 second. Dana sat across from him slowly, every movement deliberate. Aaron hovered by the doorway, silent for now. "Dad," Dana said gently, "that's what the report says. Drew's convoy was Walter cut her off. The report says what they need it to say. You and I both know that. You've seen more after-action reports than most generals in this country. When have they ever told the whole truth?" Dana didn't answer, because he was right. Walter reached into the pocket of his worn flannel jacket and pulled out a small padded envelope. It was sealed, no markings except for a single word scrawled on the front in blocky, familiar handwriting. "I got this 2 days ago," he said, sliding it across the table. "Came in the mail. No return address. I almost opened it, but I didn't. I figured it was for your eyes only." Dana's hands trembled as she picked it up. She slit the envelope open carefully. Inside was a thumb drive and a single folded piece of paper. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Drew's. She unfolded it. Her breath caught in her throat as she read, "If this reaches you, Mom, I didn't make it home. If you're reading this, something went wrong, but not the way they'll say it did. I was on to something big, something that doesn't want to be found. There's a group inside law enforcement, maybe more. They call themselves the Gatekeepers. I started tracking them after Lieutenant Hodge, remember him, got pulled from deployment and then found himself arrested back in Houston for resisting arrest. He never resisted. They beat him half to death. The pattern kept showing up. Black veterans, officers, NCOs. They're being followed, targeted, shut down, especially the ones who don't stay quiet. I collected what I could, names, locations, orders that didn't add up, screenshots, internal memos, even videos. I saved everything. It's on this drive. Don't trust anyone in uniform except you. I don't know who's in it, but they've got reach. Mom, real reach. Finish what I started. And tell Erin, tell her I'm proud she never stopped fighting, even when it cost her everything." Dana didn't realize she was crying until she felt the wetness slide down her cheek and hit the table. She held the note like it was the last living piece of him. Walter sat silently across from her, his knuckles white around his cane. "Gatekeepers," Dana whispered. The word felt heavy, loaded. "God, Drew, what did you find? Erin stepped forward now, the weight of the moment dragging every word from her mouth. We need to see what's on that drive. Right now. Dana nodded, her voice hoarse. Go get my laptop. A few minutes later, they were huddled around the screen. The drive plugged in. Folders filled the screen, labeled in Drew's meticulous style incident reports, video files, personnel links, code names, surveillance. Erin opened a video file first. It was grainy cell phone footage, time-stamped from 4 months prior. It showed a black Navy commander being pulled over outside a gas station. No resistance, no raised voice. Yet, within seconds, 3 officers tackled him to the ground, screaming about noncompliance. One kicked him in the ribs, another laughed as he lay coughing. The victim was identified in the file name Commander Tyrell Owens. Drew had written, hospitalized, 2, cracked ribs, no charges filed. They dropped the case in 2 days. Another file showed internal emails officers sharing information about black veterans returning from deployment, flagging them for behavioral watch based on race-coded language. A folder titled Command Structure contained redacted memos with initials matching city officials and high-ranking officers. Then Erin clicked open the last folder. It was labeled Houston PD, Talbot. Inside were surveillance images. Officer Rick Talbot, laughing at a table with other officers in plain clothes. One wore a shirt with a symbol, an eagle perched on a locked gate. Underneath, Order before Justice. Dana stared at the image, her breath shallow. He knew, she said. He knew exactly who I was when I walked up to that checkpoint. He wasn't checking my ID, he was confirming it. Walter's voice rumbled like distant thunder. They're not just protecting themselves, they're protecting a system. A long silence settled in the room, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. Dana closed the laptop slowly, her movements weighted by the storm rising inside her. She had buried comrades, buried friends. She had carried soldiers bleeding through desert firefights, led missions that left entire command centers trembling. But this was a different war. A war fought in boardrooms, in police precincts, in courtrooms. A war waged not with bullets, but with policies, smirks, silence, and shadows. And now they had taken her son. But Drew hadn't gone quietly. He left a trail, left a voice, left a mission. Dana looked at Erin. We're not waiting anymore. We start tonight, and outside, the street lamp flickered on, somewhere across town. Someone picked up a phone to report that the general had arrived, but they had no idea what she had just uncovered, or how far she was willing to go. The house was quieter than it had been all day, but the silence didn't bring peace. It was the kind of silence that pressed in from the walls, weighted the air, and made every ticking second sound like thunder. The laptop sat closed on the kitchen table, its screen still warm from the files they'd just seen. Outside, the streets of Third Ward slept beneath the yellow glow of tired streetlights. But inside the Mitchell kitchen, the war had already begun. Dana leaned over the counter, hands flat against the surface, shoulders tight with a tension that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with mourning weaponized by truth. Erin paced the floor, her phone buzzing with unread messages from colleagues who still didn't know the storm she and her mother had just stepped into. Then came the knock. 3 soft raps, not loud, not urgent, but sharp enough to cut through the air like a blade. Dana's head turned slightly. Erin froze mid-step. There weren't supposed to be visitors. Not at this hour. Not unannounced. Not since what they'd uncovered. Dana moved first. She didn't grab a weapon, though. Every muscle in her body moved as if she had. She didn't ask who it was. She just opened the door. Standing there in the pale porch light was a young man, soaked in sweat and nerves. His shirt clung to his frame. His eyes darted over her shoulder, and his left hand trembled slightly at his side. "General Mitchell," he said quickly. "I'm Officer Jason Chen. I worked with your son. I need to talk to you. Right now, please." Dana didn't move. Not yet. She studied him. Young, Asian American, maybe late 20s. His badge was clipped to his belt but half covered by his shirt. She noticed the scar on his temple, the slight limp in his stance. Aaron appeared beside her, voice sharp. "You were part of Drew's investigation." "Yes." He nodded, his voice strained. "And they're watching me now. But I had to come. Because I think you already know, Drew wasn't killed in combat. He was positioned to die." Dana stepped back and let him in. They sat at the table where the envelope had been opened just hours earlier, where Drew's last message still hung in the air like a presence. Chen didn't sit at first. He paced, twisting his hands, glancing toward the window, and it wasn't fear of being caught, it was fear of being believed. "I was a patrol officer assigned to Midtown," he began. "2 years ago, one of my friends, a Navy vet named Jerome Wallace, was pulled over and nearly beaten to death. They said he reached for a weapon. There was no weapon, just a VA ID. I filed an internal complaint. The report disappeared within 24 hours. Erin folded her arms. "Let me guess. The officers involved were never disciplined." Chen looked up at her. "They were promoted. One of them now heads recruitment." He sat down then, eyes flicking toward Dana. "Captain Mitchell found me. I don't know how, but he did. He showed up at my precinct one day, said he was investigating a pattern of harassment targeting black veterans in Houston, said he needed someone inside who wasn't part of it. I didn't even hesitate. I owed Jerome that much." Dana's voice was steady, but low. "And what did you find?" Chen took a deep breath. "The gatekeepers are real, not just a nickname, not just a clique. They're a network, inside HPD, inside City Hall, inside the local courts. Some of them have federal clearance, and their job, unofficially, is to identify black military personnel who show undesirable leadership tendencies. That's what they call it, especially the ones who come home and start pushing for change." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small flash drive, placing it gently on the table. "This has everything I collected: officer transfers, surveillance logs, internal comms. They monitor which units vets return to, what jobs they apply for, even what community organizations they support. It's systemic, and Drew was getting close to naming their top-tier leadership." Dana didn't blink. "So they moved his unit." Chen nodded. "Captain Mitchell sent me a message a week before his last deployment. Said he suspected his orders were altered, that his squad was placed in an exposed position by request. He was nervous, but not scared. He thought exposure would force their hand. He said if anything happened to him, I was to go to you." The room fell silent. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, its headlights cutting brief shadows across the curtains. Inside, a truth that had lived in whispers was now undeniable. "They got to him," Dana said softly. "Not because he was careless, because he was brave." Aaron leaned forward. "Can you testify to any of this?" Chen hesitated. "I can, but it won't matter. Not unless you expose the system itself. And not unless you're prepared for what comes next." Dana's eyes didn't waver. "They killed my son. They tried to humiliate me, and now they want the truth to disappear." She picked up the drive. "We won't let 'em." And somewhere across town, in a bar lit by flickering neon and thick with smoke, men in uniform with hidden emblems on their rings were already planning the next move, because they, too, had seen the general arrive, and they knew the fight hadn't even begun. Lyndon's bar didn't advertise itself as anything special. From the outside, it looked like any other low-lit watering hole on the edge of downtown wooden signage faded by sun and time, neon beer logos flickering in the windows, a crooked open sign swinging in the humid night air. But inside, past the main bar room filled with jukeboxes and idle patrons, was a door without a label, and beyond that door was a room that didn't exist on any blueprint. The back room smelled of cigars and varnish. It was paneled in dark wood, the lighting low enough to blur faces, but not enough to miss the glint of badge-shaped lapel pins, subtly worn beneath civilian jackets. A long table stretched across the room, scarred from decades of elbows, bottles, and closed-door deals. Round it sat 7 men, all white, all armed, all sworn officers with more years behind them than ahead. These were not rookies. These were not men who wondered whether the law should bend. They were the ones who bent it. At the head of the table sat Chief Allen Granger, a barrel-chested man with a voice like gravel dragged across concrete. His uniform was gone, replaced by a tailored charcoal suit, but the badge was still visible, clipped just beneath his folded hands like a signature. A reminder. He didn't speak right away. He let the silence thicken, let the weight of the moment press down on the others until even the air felt complicit. Then he spoke. "We have a situation." Rick Talbot, seated halfway down the table, didn't flinch. He already knew this was about Dana Mitchell. He had been the one to flag her at the airport, the one to confirm her arrival, the one who stood face to face with a 4-star general and dared her to blink. She hadn't, but that hadn't been the point. Granger slid a folder across the table. Inside were surveillance images, time-stamped call logs, and 3 high-resolution photos of Dana Mitchell, one at the airport, one entering her childhood home in 3rd Ward, and one taken just hours ago, speaking with a young officer outside her porch. "She's been making calls," Granger said, reaching out to D.C., "digging. We don't know how much she's uncovered yet, but it's more than we're comfortable with." One of the older men near the end of the table, Captain Glenn Harkness, grunted. "So, we push back. Shut her down. She's not some rookie sergeant." "Glenn," Granger snapped, "she's the most decorated black woman in the military. Has the president's ear. If we hit her head on, we lose. This isn't the time for muscle. This is the time for strategy." Talbot leaned in slightly. "She's attending her son's funeral this week. Jefferson Memorial, full military honors. The press will be there, high command, media vans. She'll be on camera the whole time." Granger's eyes narrowed. "Go on." Talbot's voice was even, detached. A public funeral, a black general, the perfect moment to remind the world who runs this city. Humiliation, not confrontation. Undermine her legacy. Make her outburst the story. We control the footage, seed the headlines. The rest writes itself. Another officer spoke up, younger than the others but no less bitter. "She pushes back. We say she reached for something. One shot in the air. It's enough. The rest is just crowd control." Granger didn't speak for a long time. He stared down at the table, thinking, calculating. Finally, he nodded. "We assign our own detail, 20 men, every one of them vetted, no outsiders. You'll take point. Talbot, Talbot nodded once, no emotion, no doubt, and the press Harkness asked. Granger looked up. We plan a story, concerns about her behavior, old investigation records, maybe question the son's deployment, build the narrative before she ever gets to speak. He stood then, slowly, his chair creaking beneath him. The others followed. We've kept this city in order for decades, made sure promotions went where they should, kept the streets from turning into chaos. That order is worth protecting, and if it takes knocking a few folks down to do it, so be it. He looked directly at Talbot. Make sure she learns her place. The men filed out one by one, coats over arms, no handshakes, no words. The Brotherhood of Silence didn't need fanfare. They understood each other, understood their role, understood that sometimes the most powerful institutions are the ones no one dares name. But none of them noticed the janitor lingering near the end of the hallway. Young, Hispanic, quiet, sweeping the same corner he'd cleaned twice already. They didn't notice the slight turn of his ear, or how long he waited after they left before pulling out a small recorder from his boot. Because in the shadows of every machine designed to crush the truth, there's always someone listening, someone piecing it all together, someone ready to bring light into the room that was never meant to be seen. The rain had just started when Officer Jason Chen pulled into the lot behind his apartment building, the low rumble of thunder rolling above like distant drums. Houston's summer storms didn't ask permission. They arrived, soaked everything, then vanished like ghosts. But this one felt different. It wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, it was quiet, too quiet. He killed the engine, then sat still for a moment, both hands still on the wheel. He'd driven these same streets 100 times. Patrol routes, shift changes, late-night stakeouts. But tonight, every shadow seemed longer. Every street light seems dimmer. His gut was heavy with a feeling he couldn't name. He glanced at the passenger seat. The flash drive still sat there, tucked into a manila envelope labeled Mitchell. Inside it was everything: his notes, surveillance photos, Drew's encrypted folder, a recording from Lyndon's bar that he hadn't even dared to open yet. He was on his way to drop it at an off-site location, a failsafe he'd arranged weeks ago in case things turned bad. They already had. He opened the door, stepped out into the rain, and locked the car. Just 5 steps to the stairwell, 5 steps, and he'd be back inside, where he could upload the data to the secure cloud server had built from scratch. He made it 3 steps. That's when the first blow landed. It came from behind, a steel baton cracking across the back of his neck. He staggered forward, disoriented, arms flailing. Another figure emerged from the shadows, swinging low. Chen collapsed against the pavement as a boot drove into his ribs. Then another. His breath left him in ragged gasps. He tried to roll, to crawl, to reach for the stun gun still clipped to his hip. But they were too fast. 2 men, maybe 3, all in black, no markings, no names. They didn't speak, not once. They worked methodically, like men with a checklist. One searched his pockets. The other opened the passenger door and grabbed the envelope. A third stood watch, glancing toward the corners of the lot as if expecting witnesses. But no one came. The rain drowned out the sound of fists and bone. Chen coughed blood onto the concrete. His vision blurred. A boot pinned his shoulder down as gloved hands reached for his jacket. But then came the smallest sound, a click. From beneath his body, almost invisible. The assailant hesitated, yanked harder. Another click. Chen had rigged a backup. A pressure switch. If the drive was removed without disarming the failsafe in his jacket, the files would be wiped automatically from the decoy storage. The man holding the envelope stopped. They spoke to each other in a whisper too low to hear. Then they dropped it. Back into the car. They didn't want to risk destroying the data before their bosses had eyes on it. They'd wait for instructions, but that delay, that one tiny flicker of hesitation was enough. Headlights rounded the corner. A car pulling into the lot. Maybe a neighbor, maybe nothing, but enough to scatter the attackers. The watchers vanished first, then the ones with fists and boots. They disappeared into the alley behind the dumpsters, as if they'd never been there. Chen didn't move, couldn't. His face was swollen. His vision doubled, his ribs screamed with each breath. He was still conscious when Detective Maria Vega arrived 10 minutes later. She wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't on call, but she'd been following Chen for weeks, watching him from the edges of her own investigation into officer misconduct. And something about his name had kept pinging her instincts. So she followed, and tonight, that gut feeling saved his life. She dropped to her knees beside him. "Jason," she said, voice tight. "Can you hear me?" He blinked once, then again. "Where's the drive?" He nodded weakly toward the passenger seat. She looked, saw the envelope, still there. "You're lucky," she whispered, gripping his hand. "They almost silenced you, but they hadn't. Not completely. Not yet." Paramedics arrived minutes later, cutting away his jacket, securing his spine, lifting him with care. He didn't speak again, but his hand never left hers. As the ambulance doors closed, Vega stood there in the rain, holding the envelope like a fuse that hadn't yet been lit. She didn't know who the gatekeepers were, yet not entirely, but she knew they existed. And now, she had a name, a file, a crack in the silence. Back in the 3rd Ward, General Dana Mitchell sat at her kitchen table, reviewing Chen's original files with Aaron by her side. They hadn't heard yet. They didn't know the attack had happened. But something in Dana's posture shifted. She stared at the screen. The funeral schedule, the precinct assignments, the personnel rosters for Jefferson Memorial. And she saw it. Every single officer on the funerals. Security detail had connections to Granger. Every one of them had either served under Talbot, trained in his unit, or been shielded in internal affairs reports. She closed the laptop. "If this is the battlefield," she said, her voice steady, "then I walk in ready for war, because the funeral wasn't just a ceremony anymore. It was a trap, and she would not walk into it blind." The sky over Houston had turned the color of bruised steel by the time Dana and Aaron arrived at Jefferson Memorial Cemetery. The clouds sat low, heavy with moisture and warning. But Dana didn't need the weather to tell her a storm was coming. She could feel it in her chest, in the taut silence between her and her daughter as they walked past rows of polished gravestones, names carved into stone like whispers from another world. Jefferson Memorial was one of the most revered military cemeteries in the South, second only to Arlington, generals, Medal of Honor recipients, and soldiers of every rank lay buried beneath its manicured hills. It was the place Dana had fought for her son, Captain Drew Mitchell, a soldier, a son, a man whose body had returned home in a flag-draped coffin, even if his sacrifice had not yet been honored. They were greeted by Thomas Reed, the cemetery director, a tall, narrow man with thinning gray hair and a handshake that felt like a formality more than a gesture of welcome. His office was cool, air-conditioned to an edge. Dana noticed immediately that he didn't meet her eyes when he spoke. "General Mitchell," he began, forcing a professional tone. I appreciate you making the time. I wanted to discuss a few logistical matters regarding tomorrow's ceremony." Dana stood tall, her uniform immaculate even in civilian wear. The arrangements were confirmed weeks ago. Plot 17A, Valor Section. Reed cleared his throat, pulled a folder from his desk, and began shuffling through papers. "Yes, well, that's where the misunderstanding comes in. We've had an influx of ceremonies this month, several high-profile burials. Space in the Valor Section has become limited. I'm afraid we'll need to relocate Captain Mitchell's service to East Garden." The room fell into silence. Aaron's voice came first, calm but razor-sharp. "East Garden is the old, segregated section. You renamed it for optics, but everyone here still knows what it was." Reed's jaw twitched. "We're simply trying to ensure every family has a dignified service." "The East Garden is," Dana said, her voice quiet but final. "My son died serving this country. He fought beside men buried in valor. He led them, saved them. He earned that plot with blood. And you think I'll stand beside his grave while you tuck him away in a corner meant to be forgotten?" Reed stiffened. "General, I understand your frustration." "No, you don't," Aaron snapped. "If this were a white captain, would we even be having this conversation?" Dana reached into her briefcase, pulled out the original documentation, deployment records, burial contract, military regulation excerpts, and laid them neatly on the desk. "This is the contract," she said, "and this is the law. Section 143 of the Department of Veterans Affairs. Burial Policy. You cannot reassign an approved burial site based on capacity without offering equal or superior accommodations. East Garden is neither." Reed opened his mouth, but before he could speak, a voice came from the doorway behind them. "Tom, you know this isn't right." They turned. A man stood there in a groundskeeper's uniform, shoulders broad, hands calloused, face lined from years under the sun. But his eyes dark, clear, and haunted were locked on Reed with something deeper than accusation. "Mike Saunders," he said, stepping into the office and nodding at Dana. "I'm sorry to interrupt, General, but I couldn't stay quiet." Dana studied him. "You're David's father," she said slowly. "David Saunders, Drew's best friend in the unit." Mike nodded. "Yes, ma'am. My boy came home 3 weeks before Drew. Same region, same ambush corridor. He didn't make it either." His voice wavered, but he caught it. "I know what Drew meant to him." Mike continued. "They called each other brothers when they thought no one else could hear." He looked at Reed now, voice steadying. "And you want to bury one of those brothers like a footnote." Reed looked down, shame flickering across his features. But Dana wasn't finished. "Mr. Reed," she said evenly, "I suggest you reconsider. Because if you proceed with this, you won't just be violating regulations. You'll be violating the memory of a soldier whose story this country will hear whether you like it or not." Reed nodded once, slowly. "I'll make the arrangements. Valor Section, as scheduled." Dana exhaled, tension easing by a degree, but Mike didn't leave. He lingered, stepping forward once more. "There's something else," he said. "Something you need to know." Dana and Aaron turned to face him. "Last night, some men came by, said they were part of the police security team, wanted to see the grounds. I figured that made sense, funeral detail and all, but they weren't asking about logistics. They wanted the layout, where you'd be standing, where the cameras would be placed, which direction the casket would face." Aaron's breath caught. "They asked where the closest blind spots were." Mike added, "where someone could approach without being seen." Dana's blood turned cold. Not from fear, from confirmation. The trap wasn't just theoretical now, it was being drawn to scale. "Why are you telling us this?" Aaron asked quietly. Mike swallowed hard. "Because I've already buried one son this year. I won't stand by and watch another mother lose hers." He looked at Dana, eyes fierce with conviction. "You got enemies, General, but you got allies too. Some of us are done being quiet." Dana reached out, grasped his hand, held it firm. "So am I," she said. As they left the office, the storm clouds above finally broke, sending a slow drizzle over the rows of headstones. Dana looked out over the Valor section, the place where her son would rest, not hidden, not erased, but honored. She didn't know what the gatekeepers were planning in full, but now she knew the battlefield, and that meant she could prepare to fight. The sun rose slowly over Jefferson Memorial Cemetery, casting a golden hue across the wet grass from the night's rain. It should have been a morning of reverence, of dignity, a farewell wrapped in honor. Instead, there was a tension in the air so palpable it pressed against the skin, an unease that hung like fog above the rows of gravestones, the kind of quiet that precedes something being taken not given. By 7 military personnel had already begun preparations. Honor guards rehearsed their ceremonial steps, boots thudding softly on the ground. Buglers stood to the side, polishing instruments that would soon echo grief into the wind. American flags flanked the central walkway, crisp and perfect, like the image the nation so often preferred to believe about itself. But beneath that surface, the distortion had begun. General Dana Mitchell stood near the administration building, her uniform flawless, her bearing unshakable. She had arrived before anyone else. She had walked the grounds. She had memorized the exit points, the security layout, the angles of the cameras Aaron's team had installed overnight. She had looked into every inch of the Valor section, the place they nearly denied her son, and made sure the ground where he would rest was worthy of the man he was. Her father, Walter, had already taken his place under a canopy of folding chairs, flanked by Drew's fellow soldiers. Aaron stood at Dana's side, dressed in black, clutching a copy of her brother's final letter, still sealed. The letter Dana would read publicly for the first time after the flag had been folded, but before the ceremony could begin, the guests had to arrive. That's where it began. At the cemetery gates, police in full uniform manned checkpoints far more than necessary. Officer Rick Talbot was among them, his sunglasses shielding eyes that didn't need to be seen to radiate contempt. Under his direction, guests arriving for the service were separated. No formal announcement, no signs, just an unspoken sorting of skin. White attendees were waved through with ease bags unchecked. IDs glanced at briefly, but black mourners, including Drew's old classmates, family friends, and fellow veterans, were pulled aside. Their purses rifled through. Their IDs were scanned multiple times. Some were questioned about whether they had invitations. Others were told the seating area was full and were redirected to an overflow zone 50 yards away from the Valor section, where visibility was obstructed by trees and temporary barricades. "This can't be right," one elderly veteran whispered, his hand trembling as he held out a flag pin he wore since Desert Storm. "I served with his father. I came to honor his son." A young officer offered a half-hearted shrug. Orders. Aaron moved fast. She approached the security station, her voice rising with unmistakable authority. "I'm Aaron Mitchell. I'm the sister of the man being buried here today. You're violating federal code and VA policy. You're creating a segregated funeral." Talbot appeared from behind the gate, grinning without humor. "No one's being segregated. Just following protocol. elevated security risk. We were told to be thorough. Dana appeared beside Erin then, her presence freezing the moment. "And who gave that order?" she asked, her voice ice. "Because I can assure you, I have not been informed of any elevated threat to my son's funeral. Unless, of course, you're suggesting his family is the threat." Talbot didn't answer. He didn't need to. The look on his face was answer enough. Dana turned to the crowd gathering behind the barricade's black soldiers, grieving mothers, aging veterans in full regalia, and raised her voice. "If you are here to honor Captain Drew Mitchell, you will stand with us, not behind a fence, not in the shadows. My son didn't serve in a segregated unit. He didn't die for a segregated flag, and I will not bury him in a segregated ceremony." There was a moment of stillness. Then a voice rang out from the crowd. "We're with you, General." And then another, and another. Dana turned back to Talbot. "Either you let them in, or I cancel this entire ceremony and hold it on the courthouse steps with the national press watching every second. Your move." The tension crackled. A moment passed, then another. Finally, Talbot stepped aside, motioning to the officers. "Let them through." The guests filed in, one by one, with heads high. They were tired of being told where they didn't belong. Not here, not today. By 10 a.m., the seating was full. Dana took her place at the front, her hand resting lightly on the flag-draped coffin of her son. Around her stood not just mourners, but witnesses, people who had seen the attempt to erase dignity and had refused to let it happen. She looked over at the crowd, a sea of faces black, white. Brown stood shoulder to shoulder now. Cameras from local and national outlets lined the rear. The world was watching, which meant the gatekeepers were watching too. Dana inhaled slowly, then nodded at Erin. "Give me the letter." Erin placed it in her hand with care. It was time to speak, time to tell the truth, and Drew, who they had tried to sideline even in death, was about to be heard. The wind moved gently through Jefferson Memorial Cemetery, brushing the flags into motion like whispers from the past. Rows of mourners sat in solemn silence, eyes fixed on the lone figure standing at the podium. General Dana Mitchell stood tall, her hand gripping the edge of the lectern, the weight of the folded letter in her palm grounding her more than her medals ever could. A quiet passed between every breath, a silence earned by grief, by discipline, by restraint sharpened through years of service. But what Dana was about to break wasn't just that silence. It was something far older, far heavier. And for those gathered cameras rolling, heads bowed, a nation watching it would be a truth they could not unhear. She looked out across the crowd. There was her father, eyes glossy but unflinching. Erin, hands clasped at her chest. Drew's former unit, standing in full dress uniform, boots planted like anchors in the earth, and, just beyond them, the police detail and formation officer Rick Talbot at the center, his stance too rigid, too calculated, the barrel of something more than authority resting beneath his uniform. Dana opened the letter. Her voice, when it came, was strong and clear, not just a mother speaking, but a soldier, a witness, a vessel for the truth her son had died to protect. "If you're hearing this," she began, "it means I didn't make it home." A murmur rippled through the audience. Cameras clicked into a frenzy. Dana didn't pause. "I didn't write this as a farewell. I wrote it because I knew something was wrong. I knew someone would come for me before I could finish what I started. But if you're reading these words, then they failed. They couldn't stop you. Mom." Her voice tightened, just a notch. but she pushed forward. For months, I've been tracking a group embedded inside our police departments, inside our courts, inside our military. They call themselves the gatekeepers. But what they really are is a sickness, one that infects the places we tell ourselves are sacred. A collective shift moved through the crowd. Journalists leaned forward, cell phones tilted up. Talbot's eyes narrowed behind his sunglasses, his jaw tight. Dana continued, "They don't wear robes, they don't burn crosses, they don't hang nooses. But what they do is just as dangerous. They identify black service members who lead too well, speak too loudly, inspire too many. Then they target them, with traffic stops, with reassignment, with character smears, and sometimes, if that's not enough." She paused. The breeze stirred the pages in her hands. Her throat burned, but her spine did not bend. "They make sure we don't come back." The audience was silent now, not with discomfort, but with awakening. Something had cracked open. Something sacred and something ugly. "Captain Drew Mitchell," Dana said, her voice hardening, "did not die by enemy fire. His deployment was manipulated. His position was chosen. He was sent into a trap designed not by insurgents, but by a network of men in this country who could not stand that a black soldier might rise higher than their own hate would allow." She let the words hang in the air, like the flag that hung behind her son's coffin. "My son died serving a country that has not always served him. But he died with honor. He died standing. And I am here now to do the same." She closed the letter. Talbot shifted. Dana raised her eyes to the crowd again. "If you're wondering what you should do with this truth, let it make you uncomfortable. Let it make you angry. Let it remind you that freedom does not protect itself, that democracy doesn't mean anything unless it applies to all of us, and that silence, in the face of this, is complicity." Then, for the first time in the entire ceremony, she looked directly at Talbot, unflinching, measured. A commander recognizing the enemy in plain clothes. "You thought this would be a funeral," she said, "but it's a reckoning." She stepped down from the podium. The crowd erupted not in cheers, but in an electric silence that buzzed with the pulse of history bending. And that was when Talbot moved. From the edge of the police formation, he broke ranks, stepping forward, hand at his belt, eyes locked on Dana. She saw the twitch in his wrist, the shift in his posture. Military training sharpened every frame of the moment. Her breath slowed, her muscles coiled. He was no longer hiding it. The gun was already chambered, and in that fraction of a second, the country held its breath. The crack of the gunshot split the still air like a lightning bolt, freezing every breath, every blink, every heartbeat in Jefferson Memorial Cemetery. For a split second, no one moved. Then came the screams. Some guests ducked. Others rose instinctively to shield loved ones. Uniformed veterans reached for weapons they no longer carried. The press surged forward. Cameras now aimed not at a casket, but at chaos. Dana Mitchell didn't flinch. She had lived through mortars, ambushes, the whir of helicopters lifting dying men from battlefields. But this, the barrel of a police-issued Glock pressed against her temple in front of her son's coffin, was something else entirely. It was not a battlefield. It was a warning. Officer Rick Talbot's voice hissed through gritted teeth. "General Mitchell, you're under arrest for attempted incitement and threatening a peace officer. Step away from the podium." His breath was hot, his hand was steady, but his eyes betrayed something different. Not duty, not fear, desperation. And then Dana knew this wasn't about law. It never had been. It was about silencing her in the only language cowards trusted: force. Aaron cried out from the front row. Mom Dana didn't look at her. She didn't look at anyone. Her eyes remained forward, her spine unbroken. "I'm unarmed," she said clearly, loud enough for the cameras, for the crowd, for the nation to hear, and you know that. Talbot pressed the barrel harder against her temple. "You reached for something." "I reached for a letter. A eulogy." A voice shouted from behind, brash, authoritative. "She's lying. She was reaching for a weapon." It was Officer Brent Wilson, Talbot's second in command, already moving through the crowd with a service rifle strapped across his chest. He fired another shot, this one into the air, purposefully loud, calculated, a show, a smoke screen. Gasps exploded again, and then they moved. 2 officers broke from the formation like wolves from a pack. They shoved past the honor guard, knocking over chairs, trampling rose petals and ceremonial wreaths. They charged the stage not to protect Dana, but to seize her. Aaron surged forward, only to be intercepted and shoved back, nearly falling over the front row barrier. A veteran from Drew's unit tried to step between Dana and the incoming officers. He was tackled, face first, into the soil he once fought to defend. Dana stood her ground, still motionless, even as her son's flag-draped casket stood inches from where Talbot now barked commands. "Restrain her." They grabbed her arms. Cold steel cuffs bit into her wrists, the same wrists that had saluted 3 presidents, that had steadied wounded soldiers in desert storms, that had handed her son his first set of dog tags. They forced her down onto her knees in the grass, not beside the casket, into it. Her cheek pressed against the dirt next to the corner of the marble headstone not yet engraved. The same ground they once tried to deny her son. Aaron's voice cracked through the screaming crowd. "It's on video every second you're being filmed." And it was. Phones rose like a sea of truth. Every camera caught Talbot's weapon. Every lens recorded the fire in Dana's eyes as she was shoved beside her son's grave. And above it all, her voice rang out not broken, but rising. "This is what they do to us," she said. "Even at our own graves. Even when we bury our heroes." Talbot shouted something unintelligible, but it was too late. The media wasn't focused on his face. They were zoomed in on Dana, still dignified, even on the ground. Her Medal of Honor smeared with soil, her wrists bruised, her voice was unshaken, and in that moment the narrative changed. She wasn't a woman under arrest, she was a symbol under assault. Within 20 minutes, the first cell phone video hit social media. By 40 minutes, it had 3 million views. By the end of the hour, it was on every major network. A general arrested at her own son's funeral, a black woman held at gunpoint while honoring her dead, shot fired not by enemies, but by those sworn to protect. And beneath each headline, the same frame, Dana Mitchell, on her knees, her head high, as men tried to push her lower, but they couldn't. Because what they didn't understand, what they had never understood, was that this wasn't a moment of defeat. It was ignition. All across the country, people stopped what they were doing. Offices fell silent. Classrooms paused. Military bases played the footage in quiet clusters. Veterans wept. Young soldiers clenched fists. Mothers cried. And, across living rooms, a single sentence echoed again and again. The shot wasn't meant to kill. It was meant to distract while they dragged her down. But, in trying to bury her, they had unearthed the truth, and the world was watching. General, Dana Mitchell came home not to be honored, but to be hunted. What began as a mother's return to bury her son spiraled into a public reckoning. From the airport, where Officer Rick Talbot humiliated her in uniform, to the family kitchen where she discovered her son's encrypted whistleblower files. Dana uncovered the existence of the gatekeepers, a covert network infiltrating police, courts, and the military to suppress black leadership. With evidence mounting and allies emerging, including Officer Jason Chen and Detective Maria Vega, Dana prepared to face a funeral-turned-battlefield. The gatekeepers plotted to disgrace her during her son's service. But when she read his final letter aloud, exposing the system before a national audience, they panicked. Officers stormed the stage. Talbot drew his gun, and Dana was tackled in front of her son's casket. Yet, in that humiliation, the truth went viral. A Medal of Honor recipient dragged through cemetery dirt became a symbol for every silenced voice. But this war isn't over. The gatekeepers are exposed, but not defeated. And as the nation reels from the footage, Dana's next move will shake the very ground they stand on. The question is no longer if justice will rise, it's how far she's willing to go to make it happen. Under the fluorescent flicker of Harris County Jail's intake corridor, General Dana Mitchell stood motionless. Her wrists raw beneath the cold bite of steel cuffs, her uniform, once pristine, was streaked with cemetery soil. Her medals had been stripped away. Her rank had not been acknowledged. Her rights had not been read, and her request for counsel had been denied with nothing more than a smirk. The arresting officers had offered no explanation other than pending investigation. No charges were logged. No record of her detainment had yet reached her attorney. It was a holding without a name, silencing without justification, and it had only just begun. The echo of her boots, confiscated now, replaced with orange slip-ons, faded behind her as she was led down a quiet hallway, one far from the usual processing wings. No fingerprinting, no mugshot, just a silent transfer through steel doors and eyes that wouldn't meet hers. Officer Lucinda Hall, the woman escorting her, walked with a stiffness that didn't match cruelty. It suggested fear, not of Dana, of the orders she was following. "This isn't standard," Dana said calmly. Her voice carried a weight that made people pause without knowing why. "You know it isn't." Officer Hall didn't answer, but her grip on Dana's arm loosened slightly. She tapped the keypad with a guarded glance toward the camera in the corner. The door buzzed open. "This way," she muttered. They walked into a dimly lit section of the jail marked as a temporary medical ward, though there were no patients, no nurses, no staff, just a long corridor of empty holding cells, except for one at the far end door already open, inside a steel bed with no mattress, a sink without running water, and walls that looked like they had forgotten the meaning of color. Dana stepped in. She turned, expecting the clank of the door, but Hall didn't move to shut it right away. "I'll bring food at shift change," the officer said. Then, quieter, with a glance down the hallway, "I'm sorry, you're not in the system, not officially." Dana stared at her. "So I've disappeared." Hall's throat bobbed. "Just don't trust the cameras. They're on, even when they say they're not." Then she closed the door. The lock clicked, sharp and final. Hours passed without time. The cell had no window, no clock, no light that dimmed or changed. Dana sat upright on the bench, her spine refusing to bend even in the stillness. Her fingers traced the faint scar on her wrist, an old injury from Kandahar, where she'd carried a wounded soldier under fire for miles. She thought of Drew, of the letter, of the roar of silence that followed a shot meant to erase her, of the faces in the crowd shocked, recording, bearing witness. They would try to break her here, but she had endured worse, and now there were things she still needed to do. They hadn't won. Not yet. A rustle broke the quiet. Down the corridor, a shadow moved. Dana stood, her eyes focused. The figure stepped closer, moving with the easy confidence of someone who wasn't used to being stopped. A woman. Tall, broad-shouldered, her jumpsuit baggy but revealing a kind of grounded strength in every motion. Her braids were tied back, her hands bore the calluses of labor, but her eyes, dark and direct, were soft with something Dana hadn't expected to find here. Recognition. "You don't remember me," the woman said, voice smooth and even. Dana tilted her head. "Should I?" The woman smirked. "Afghanistan. Outpost Red Rock. You medevaced my little brother. Specialist Nathan Rhodes. Gunshot to the thigh. You kept pressure on the wound all the way to the chopper. He came home, married his high school sweetheart, started a family, all because you didn't let him bleed out in the dust." Dana's posture didn't change, but her breath caught just slightly. "Teresa Rhodes," the woman said, nodding. "Lieutenant, once, until I came back and decided to say something about a commanding officer harassing new female recruits. You can guess how that went." Dana knew exactly how that went. "I punched the bastard." Teresa continued. "They tossed me, called it dishonorable. Then I got pulled in for a possession charge I still swear wasn't mine. That's how I ended up here. But even here, word travels. We heard what they did to you. Word spread quickly. And we ain't all asleep in here." Dana studied her. "You're a leader here." Teresa gave a low chuckle. "Leader? No. But people listen, especially the ones who know what it means to be forgotten, to be set up, to be called dangerous just for not folding." She looked around, then stepped closer to the bars. "You're not alone in this place. General, not here, not outside. Some of us still believe in what those stars on your shoulder used to mean, and, more importantly, what they mean now." Dana didn't speak for a moment. The silence between them was thick, but not hostile. It was the silence of two people who knew the terrain of battle, whether it came with bullets or bars. "They're isolating me for a reason," Dana said finally. "Whatever comes next, it won't be lawful." Teresa's eyes narrowed. "We'll make sure someone sees it if they try. You won't vanish here. I'll see to it. So will Officer Hall. She's not like the others. She sees what this is." Dana nodded once, her voice low. "Thank you." Teresa took a half step back. "When it's time to stand, we'll stand with you. Word already hit the outside. Someone's moving. That much I know. You just hold steady in here." She turned to go, but paused. "In the system meant to break you. Some of us are still holding the line. Not because of orders, but because we remember who you are." The heavy steel door at the end of the hallway buzzed again. Teresa vanished into the shadows. Dana sat down, hands resting on her knees. She didn't know how long she'd be held here, how long they'd keep her name off the books, but now she wasn't invisible, and that meant the clock was ticking for everyone involved. And outside those walls, someone wasn't staying silent. Under a sky blanketed in quiet darkness, the gates of Harris County Jail stood colder than the night around it. The high perimeter walls, topped with coils of barbed wire, usually faded into the urban sprawl of Houston's east side. But tonight, they had become the center of a growing silence. Not the kind born from fear, but from resolve. from the weight of boots planted on asphalt, from the eyes of those who had seen war and returned with the spine unbent, and now they gathered here not for battle, but for truth. Erin Mitchell stood at the front of the gathering, her face drawn but unwavering. She wore no robe, no badge, no armor, only a long black coat wrapped tight against the chill, and her brother's folded funeral program tucked into her chest pocket. The print had smudged slightly where tears had dried, but she wasn't here to grieve. Not tonight. She was here because her mother had been taken, because the state had decided that justice was optional when it came to black women, and because that silence needed to end. One by one, they arrived, first in pairs, then in clusters, then in waves. Some came by motorcycle, others in dusty pickup trucks still bearing Iraq and Afghanistan stickers. Their movements were quiet, intentional, no chants, no signs, just presence. Rows of veterans lined the outer gate in disciplined formation, each man and woman standing shoulder to shoulder. They wore patches from different wars. Some carried canes, others prosthetic limbs. Some leaned on comrades they hadn't seen in years. Most hadn't spoken more than a few words, but their uniforms told the story loud enough. Bronze stars, purple hearts, unit insignias that whispered of battles from Fallujah to Kandahar. These were not civilians staging a protest. These were warriors returning to the front for a different kind of mission. And at the heart of it all stood Agent Marcus Reed, newly assigned to the Houston Field Office, Civil Rights Division of the FBI. Reed had served once 2 Army Ranger, now in plain clothes, his eyes scanning the crowd not for threats, but for something deeper, alignment, momentum, a spark he'd seen in other countries during other conflicts when the people had finally had enough. He approached Erin quietly, his tone clipped but respectful. "Ms. Mitchell, Agent Marcus Reed. I've read the initial reports. What happened to your mother? It doesn't add up." Erin turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "That's putting it lightly." Reed nodded. She was arrested without charge, denied counsel, removed from a federal property without authorization, and everything suggests it was orchestrated from within the department. It was more than that, Erin said. It was an execution in slow motion, public, intentional, and caught on camera. She gestured toward the gate behind them. "We're not just here to send a message. We're here because we know how this ends if we don't stand between her and the machine." Reed studied her for a moment. "I'm opening a formal civil rights investigation. I'll need access to internal communications from Harris County Sheriff's Office, HPD, and any interagency logs from the day of the funeral. I also need the files your mother received from Captain Mitchell." Erin's eyes narrowed. "That's not a small ask." "I know," Reed said, "but if we do this together, we might actually win." A murmur moved through the crowd. A veteran stepped forward, then another. They didn't speak. They simply formed a tighter line, shoulders squared toward the facility that held one of their own. Because that's what Dana Mitchell had become to them, not just a general, not just a mother, but a symbol of what still needed defending. One of the veterans, a Marine Corps sergeant in his 70s with silver stubble and a faded tattoo of the globe and anchor, raised his voice just enough to cut through the air. "She bled for this country. We bled with her. And now they're trying to bury her name before her son's grave is even cold." His words weren't followed by applause, just silence, heavily felt, deeply respected. Reed pulled out his phone, typing a message with practiced urgency. A minute later, his secure FBI email lit up with a file from internal databases. Something flagged days earlier. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, showing her the screen. "This is a transfer order for the precinct security detail at the funeral, signed by someone with a falsified clearance code. Your mother was targeted from the inside. Erin didn't need to read it twice. She simply nodded. Then we bring it outside. We leak what we have. That might compromise the case." Reed warned. "Or it might save her life." She snapped. "Because if we wait, if we play by their timeline, they'll bury her under sealed court motions and procedural delay until no one remembers she's even in there." Reed didn't argue. He knew she was right, and he wasn't here to contain outrage. He was here to honor it. Behind them, a low rumble began. Motorcycles approaching in steady sequence. A dozen more veterans arrived. Female soldiers, Latinx guardsmen, a Sikh combat medic with scars above one eye. They joined the line without needing to ask where. They knew what was happening, and they knew where they stood. A journalist nearby finally broke the code of silence, lifting a handheld recorder. "Ms. Mitchell, is this a protest?" Erin turned slowly. Her answer was clear. "This is a formation." Cameras clicked. Headlines began to draft themselves. The image of hundreds of veterans standing outside Harris County Jail under a bannerless sky began circulating across newsrooms. No press release had gone out. No spokesperson had summoned attention. But the brass on Dana's shoulder, the rank she had carried into every hostile zone, still meant something to those who had worn it too. Inside the facility, guards whispered, phones buzzed, and though Dana Mitchell didn't know yet what was happening outside her cell, the system that tried to break her had already started to tremble, and at the same moment, a correctional officer deep within the jail paused outside Dana's isolated cell. She looked both ways, ensuring no one was watching, then reached slowly into her coat pocket. In her palm was a small, unmarked object wrapped in a cloth napkin. A phone, hidden, powered on, ready, because not everyone in the system had forgotten their oath, and not everyone inside the walls was willing to stay silent. The fluorescent lights in Harris County Detention Center never really turned off. Even at 3 a.m., they hummed overhead like a presence, casting a pale, artificial glow across the concrete walls that seemed to hum with secrets. The air was thick with the scent of bleach and rust, and the silence was broken only by the occasional clink of keys or the shuffling of shoes down a distant corridor. But in one isolated block, Unit 4B, something was happening that wasn't on any schedule. Dana Mitchell sat on the edge of her bunk, elbows on her knees, fingers interlaced. Her dress uniform had been stripped away, replaced with a county-issued jumpsuit 2 sizes too big, but she still carried herself like she was standing in front of a command post. She hadn't been given a phone call, hadn't seen a lawyer. For the last 12 hours, the system had tried to pretend she didn't exist. But erasure, Dana knew, was never complete. Not if you refused to go quietly. A soft knock echoed against the steel door of her cell. Not the usual clang of protocol. It was deliberate, almost cautious. Dana stood slowly. The viewing slot slid open, and behind it appeared the face of Officer Lucinda Hall, the same guard who had quietly handed her the water bottle when she first arrived. The one who didn't look away when Dana met her eyes. There was something unreadable in Lucinda's gaze, part fear, part resolve. "I got something," Lucinda whispered. "You didn't hear it from me. You never saw me." The hatch closed. A second later, the door buzzed faintly, unlocking just enough to crack open. No alarms, no lights, just a sliver of opportunity. Lucinda slipped inside, her eyes darting to the surveillance camera in the corner. It was still blinking red. Maintenance reported a glitch on this unit 2 hours ago. She said quickly, "Cameras down. Won't be for long." From her pocket, Lucinda pulled a prepaid burner phone wrapped in latex gloves. "You have 10 minutes," she said. "Make it count." Dana didn't hesitate. She took the phone with steady hands, crouched beside the metal toilet, and dialed from memory. Aaron answered on the second ring. "Mom." Are you okay?" Aaron's voice was thick with panic, relief, fury all braided together. "I'm safe," Dana said, her voice low but unwavering. "Listen carefully. We don't have long. Where are they keeping you? Do you know the charges? They haven't told me anything. No arraignment, no lawyer. They're burying me." "Aaron, not legally systemically," Aaron replied, already moving. Dana could hear the shuffle of papers, a laptop powering up. "We're outside. Vets from 4 different units. We've got media interest. Marcus Reed's with us now. Civil Rights Division is coming in." Dana exhaled. "That helps, but I need you to dig deeper. The judge assigned to my case Harlan Eckhart." There was a beat of silence on the other end. Aaron spoke slowly. "Eckhart. That name sounds familiar. Wait, he's the same judge Drew was investigating." Dana said 3 years ago. Drew suspected him of dismissing misconduct cases involving black and brown service members, especially ones flagged by HPD. "Oh my God," Aaron breathed. "I remember now." Drew said Eckhart was suppressing evidence, shuffling prosecutors, even having some of the reports sealed under national security pretext. Dana's voice turned steel. "And now he's the one presiding over my case. This isn't incompetence. It's orchestration." Aaron was silent for a second too long. What Dana asked, I just cross-checked something," Aaron whispered. "Mom, there's a private case on the docket filed 2 days before your arrest. It's labeled a security clearance reassessment for you, filed by a subcommittee inside the Department of Defense. Quiet classification shift. You're being repositioned as a potential federal threat." Dana closed her eyes. That was the play. Not just prison, not just silence. They were building the framework to scrub her legacy, to discredit her entire career in one buried hearing, to turn her from a general into a threat profile erased not by gunfire, but by bureaucracy. "They didn't just want me silenced," Dana said quietly. "They wanted me erased from history. We won't let that happen," Aaron promised. "I'll file an injunction first thing in the morning. I'll bring this to the press, the Pentagon, the Civil Rights Council. If they want war, we'll bring them one." Dana paused. "Aaron, I need you to find someone. Judge Eckhart's clerk from 3 years ago, Maya Sandoval. Drew said she started leaking files before she went off the grid." "I'm on it," Aaron said. "You'll be out of there, I swear." The call timer flashed red. Lucinda stepped forward. "Time's up." Dana closed the phone, handed it back, and met Lucinda's gaze. "Thank you," she said. Lucinda didn't smile. She just nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "Your son saved my sister in Kandahar," she whispered. "I never forgot." Then she slipped out the way she came, sealing the door behind her. Dana sat back down on the bunk. The hum of the lights returned, and with it, the stillness of the night. But somewhere far from the jail, nestled in a cabin by a lake long forgotten by city maps, a figure stirred in the dark. Someone long believed missing. Someone who had once walked corridors of power. And someone who now held pieces of the truth they never expected to survive. The silence was ending, and the resistance was just beginning. The rain had tapered to a mist by the time Agent Marcus Reed's black SUV pulled off the gravel road and crept toward the cabin. Nestled deep in the pines outside of Waller County, the structure was barely visible under the canopy of trees. Its slanted tin roof glistened under the early morning drizzle, and a wisp of smoke trailed from the chimney subtle, almost cautious, like everything about the people inside. This wasn't just a safe house. It was a stronghold, carved out of necessity by men and women who had stopped trusting the institutions they once served. Inside, Officer Jason Chen sat propped on a cot near the stone fireplace, bandaged from shoulder to hip. His breath was shallow but steady, every inhale a quiet defiance. They had tried to silence him. They had come close, but silence doesn't hold when the truth still burns in your chest, and Jason had lit a fire they couldn't contain. His laptop hummed softly beside him, a cracked screen blinking with encrypted folders. Next to it, a weatherproof external hard drive, steel casing, dual-layered encryption. Beside it, a recording that could fracture a city, a police force, and a legacy sewn together by corruption. Erin Mitchell stood by the window, arms crossed, her reflection in the glass barely visible through the fogged-up panes. She hadn't slept in 28 hours. Her phone had died somewhere near the county line, and she hadn't bothered to plug it back in. There were no calls she wanted to take, only one conversation that mattered now. "Are you sure it's his voice?" she asked, turning toward Chen. Her tone was measured, but the fire in her eyes gave her away. Chen nodded slowly. I filtered the background noise, matched the cadence, ran a vocal signature comparison against his old press conferences. It's him. No doubt. Reed stepped forward, his FBI badge tucked into his coat pocket. No need to flash it here. Everyone in the room knew who he was and why he'd come. He was the kind of agent who'd stopped believing in career ladders a decade ago. Civil rights investigations didn't get you promoted, but they gave you something harder to come by: clarity. He looked down at the drive. Play it. Chen reached for the laptop, fingers trembling slightly as he cued the file. The audio was tinny at first, a scrape of a chair, the clink of a whiskey glass. Then came the voice, gravel thick, measured, dangerous in its calm. "You tell Senator McConnell I don't care how many medals the kid has. If he keeps digging, he gets reassigned. We've got a deployment window in Kandahar. High risk, no backup. You know the zone." A pause, then another voice, uncertain. "What if it leaks Granger again? Colder this time. Then we bury it. Same as before. This is about order. Drew Mitchell isn't a hero. He's a liability, and I don't want his mother anywhere near that investigation. You hear me? If she shows up, you make sure the protocol gets followed. You make her into a threat." Silence followed, a long, suffocating stretch of it. The file ended with the sound of laughter, low, bitter, as if mocking the very idea of consequence. No one moved for a full 30 seconds. Then Erin exhaled. Jesus. Chen looked up. This isn't just about Drew. Granger had Senate backing. They were placing black officers in high-risk rotations deliberately, targeting leadership potential, anyone who filed too many complaints, anyone who pushed for reform. Reed nodded grimly. This isn't departmental misconduct. This is conspiracy. Federal, with military entanglement. At the far end of the cabin, 3 older men stirred from their chairs, veterans who had served with Drew overseas, Sergeant Ben Holloway, Corporal Malik Rivers, and Lieutenant Eva Jordan. Each bore the signs of the service: old scars, faded tattoos, eyes that saw too much. They had followed Drew not just because of his rank, but because of his integrity. And now, Even in death, they followed him still. "It's time to bring this forward," Ben said, "not just to the press, to the courts. If we sit on this, they win." Erin stepped closer to the fire, the flicker lighting the hard lines of her face. "We go to Judge Coleman. She's one of the few left with a record clean enough to touch this." Chen shook his head. "You can't just walk into court with a flash drive. You need corroboration, witnesses, chain of custody. Otherwise, they'll bury it in procedure." Reed rubbed his temples. "We're going to need a pre-trial injunction, and someone from DOJ to authorize a protection order for Dana. If she goes before that judge without backing, they'll lock her down before she can say good morning." Erin looked at him. "Then we move fast. She's still in Harris County detention. If we wait, they'll transfer her to federal holding. Or worse." Jason hesitated. "There's more." He reached under the cot and pulled out a second drive. This one's raw footage from a precinct camera in East Houston, March 12th. "Watch it." Erin inserted it into the laptop. The screen lit up with black and white footage, no audio this time. It showed a small interrogation room. A black man in civilian clothes, handcuffed, sat slumped in a chair. The timestamp confirmed it was just 2 weeks before Drew's final deployment. A uniformed officer entered the stocky build, unmistakable posture. Talbot. He leaned in, whispered something to the man, then casually adjusted his watch. 30 seconds later, the lights flickered. A third man entered. No badge, no uniform, just a clipboard and a baseball cap pulled low. He handed Talbot a file. Talbot read it, nodded once, then stepped back. The feed ended. Jason paused the frame. The man in cuffs was a vet. Same unit as Drew. He disappeared 2 days later. His name was Malcolm Tate. Reed stepped forward. They ruled it suicide. But Drew didn't believe it. That's when he stopped sharing his findings through channels. That's when he started going dark. The room pulsed with anger now. It wasn't loud. It wasn't shouted. But it vibrated just beneath the surface, an anger worn by people too disciplined to scream, too seasoned to break, and too righteous to stop. Erin looked at the group. "We take the file to Coleman. Reed, you prep the DOJ. Jason, stay offline until we signal. No movement unless it's encrypted." Ben nodded. "And us." Erin met his gaze. "You come with me. We deliver this in person. I want uniforms. I want rank. Let them see who they're really up against." A silence settled one last time before they all moved. Chen leaned back against the cot, exhaustion sinking into every inch of his frame. But his eyes were alive. "You think one voice memo can bring down an empire?" he asked. Erin didn't blink. "Only if the right ears hear it." Reed checked his watch. "Let's make sure they do." And as the sun finally began to rise behind the trees, the cabin door swung open. The wind carried the scent of wet pine and distant smoke. The truth had been buried long enough, and now it was coming to the surface. The game had changed, and Dana Mitchell, caged but not broken, was about to face the man who ordered her son's death. The morning broke over Houston like a storm held just at bay, thick skies. No sun, the kind of pressure in the air that felt like a held breath. Outside the Harris County Jail, the crowds had thinned but never left. Veterans still stood in quiet ranks. Journalists circled like vultures who'd grown afraid of what they were watching. Inside, Dana Mitchell stood in the center of her cell, her hands clasped behind her back, spine straight, eyes locked on the small rectangular slit in the door. She was still a general, even behind bars, even in chains. At 7:03 a.m., the door opened. Officer Lucinda Hall entered, her face unreadable beneath a tight jawline and eyes that had witnessed far more than they could carry. In her gloved hands, she held a folded set of clothes, civilian, pressed, pristine. "Dress quickly," she said, voice low. "You're being transferred." Dana didn't move. "Where?" she asked. Lucinda hesitated, then took a small step closer and whispered, "You'll be walked out the front, escorted in plain sight. No charges have been filed. The DA just recused himself. Governor made a call." Dana's eyes narrowed. She understood what this meant. Power was shifting. Someone up high had decided her silence was no longer expected. They needed her voice now, not in defiance, in strategy. She dressed without a word. The uniform they gave her was civilian, but every movement in it carried military precision. She buttoned her shirt slowly, smoothed the fabric down her sides, adjusted her watch. Not a second was wasted. When she turned to Hall, her voice was steel. "Where am I going?" Lucinda paused again, then answered, "The Lion's Den." 15 minutes later, Dana stepped into the wood-paneled office of Chief Alan Granger. The door closed behind her with a click that echoed far too loud for such a quiet room. Granger was already waiting, seated behind a desk made from polished mahogany, the American flag behind him, a framed portrait of a young soldier in a crisp blue uniform just over his shoulder. The image was supposed to remind visitors of patriotism. Today, it was a lie dressed in walnut and brass. "General Mitchell," he said, standing as if to offer respect, but his tone oozed with patronization. "Or do I call you citizen?" Now Dana didn't sit. She didn't blink. "I think you know exactly who I am," she said. Granger chuckled, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. "Please, sit. Let's talk like adults. No cameras, no lawyers, just two professionals trying to keep the city from turning into a spectacle." Dana sat slowly, her posture unchanged, gaze locked onto him like a marksman lining up a target. Hidden beneath her collar, barely visible to the naked eye, was a small microphone, a specialized transmitter embedded in the lapel, coated in Kevlar-thin cloth, provided by the governor's legal liaison just before her transfer. This conversation would be recorded in full, no edits, no denials. Granger poured himself a glass of water, not for thirst, for show. "You know," he began, "this could have gone differently. You didn't have to make a scene at that funeral. All that emotion, all that chaos, it made you look unstable." Dana leaned forward just enough. "You had me arrested at my son's grave, pointed a gun at my head. That wasn't a scene. That was an ambush." Granger waved his hand like he was swatting a mosquito. "You're exaggerating. I have 17 camera angles that say otherwise." He smiled. "And who do you think owns those networks?" Dana didn't respond. She didn't need to. The tension in the room was building, not just from their exchange, but from the weight of history pressing in from all sides. This wasn't just a battle of words. This was the moment before detonation. Granger sipped his water and then set it down with deliberate precision. "You came here for something," he said. "So ask." Dana exhaled slowly, as if she had been waiting years for this performance. "I came for the truth," she said. "You know what happened to my son. You know who changed his orders. You know who built this network inside HPD, and you're going to tell me. Because if you don't, I'll make sure every survivor, every mother, every uniform you ever betrayed comes to your doorstep." Granger laughed. Not with humor, with disbelief. "You think I'm scared of you," he said, his tone now flint. You're a relic, Mitchell. A 4-star general who forgot who writes the script when the war's over. You think this city bends to the truth? It bends to power, to influence, to silence. Dana tilted her head slightly. So you're admitting it. Granger leaned back in his chair. Something in his expression had shifted, like he knew this moment would come. Maybe he had prepared for it. Maybe he was arrogant enough to believe it wouldn't matter. You want names, you want a confession, I asked. Mockingly. Fine. He stood, walked slowly to the bookshelf behind him, pulled a small folder from the bottom drawer of a false panel, tossed it onto the table. That's the deployment roster. Your son's transfer came through the Senate liaison office. You know who signed it? He leaned in, mouth inches from her face. Senator McConnell approved it personally. Unstable command presence. That's the phrase they used. Code for inspirational black man with too much visibility. He was never supposed to come back. Dana's fingers curled into fists under the desk, but she didn't speak. Granger kept going. We've been doing this for years, Mitchell. Quietly, efficiently. You want to talk about the gatekeepers, you're late to the party. We don't hide anymore. We promote, we endorse, we build the fences while the public watches the front door. You're chasing ghosts. Dana said nothing. She didn't need to. Granger sat back down, pleased with himself, unaware that every word he had just spilled was being transmitted in real time to a federal holding server. Agent Marcus Reed had been listening from the operations van outside for 5 full minutes. The red light on the receiver had never blinked. The signal was clean. The chain of custody intact. Dana slowly stood. She reached for the folder, looked Granger in the eye. "Thank you," she said. He blinked, confused. For what? For letting the rot finally speak? She turned and walked to the door. Behind her, Granger laughed again, but it was a little tighter now, less certain. Outside the office, 3 unmarked vehicles were already pulling up, inside the lead car. Agent Reed was holding the signed warrant with one hand and a sealed indictment file in the other. The moment the audio finished transmitting, his earpiece crackled. Confirmation received. Proceed. Inside his office, Granger poured himself another drink, and just as he brought the glass to his lips, the door burst open. "Chief Alan Granger," Reed said, stepping forward, badge raised. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, civil rights violations under color of law, and the orchestrated murder of Captain Andrew Mitchell." The glass hit the floor, and the lion's den became a cage. The sun had barely cracked the skyline when the first door splintered open. It wasn't a military strike, but it carried the precision of one. Across Houston, at exactly 5:31 a.m., a coordinated wave of federal agents surged through neighborhoods, police precincts, and private homes. Black SUVs lined curbs like rows of silent judges. Helicopter blades cut the early morning stillness above Harris County, casting flickering shadows across manicured lawns and cracked concrete alike. The targets had been named days ago, vetted, confirmed, and circled in red on maps spread across the floor of a federal operations center. 21 individuals, all law enforcement officers, all part of a network buried so deep in the city's institutions that it had taken a funeral to expose them. Agent Marcus Reed led the operation, dressed in plain, tactical black. He stood outside the Midtown precinct, eyes locked on the entrance, earpiece crackling with synchronized updates from other teams across the city. Unit 7, status package secured. Unit 9, hallway cleared. Suspect restrained. He didn't smile. Not yet. not until the head of the snake was in cuffs. Inside the Midtown station, chaos unfolded in controlled bursts. Officers, once shielded by power and silence, found themselves cornered in locker rooms, briefing chambers, even parking garages. Some cursed, some begged. One tried to draw a weapon but was dropped before the barrel cleared his holster. They were outnumbered, unprepared, out of time. At exactly 6 a.m., Chief Alan Granger's front door was kicked off its hinges. He had been asleep at least until the red dots danced across his bedsheets. Half-dressed and furious, he lunged toward the nightstand, only to be pinned to the hardwood floor by two agents with precision honed by months of anticipation. They said nothing as they cuffed him, nothing as they read him his rights, nothing as they hauled him past the rows of framed commendations on his hallway wall. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he spat, lips twisted with rage. "I built this city's spine." Agent Reed met his eyes, calm and unwavering. "Then I guess it's time we check it for rot." Outside, cameras had already gathered. News crews, tipped by whispers and sources no longer willing to stay silent, had converged on the scene just as Granger was escorted through his front yard in handcuffs. The moment was captured from every angle, his bare feet on the dew-covered lawn, his bathrobe flapping in the wind, the iron bars of the cruiser closing behind him. The broadcast went live within minutes, and the country watched. It was the image no one expected to see, the same chief who had stood for decades as the untouchable face of order, now stuffed into the back seat like a common criminal. But it didn't end there. At the precinct near Harrisburg, Officer Brent Wilson was pulled from the gym mid-workout, still dripping sweat. He laughed when the agents entered until he saw the paperwork in Reed's hand. Indictments, charges, surveillance transcripts, recordings. Wilson's smirk collapsed into something hollow. "You don't get it," he stammered. "We were protecting the real America." Reed's tone didn't change. Then the real America just pressed charges for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and targeted abuse under color of law. By 7 a.m., 21 officers had been taken into custody, all connected to the gatekeepers, all implicated in a sprawling case that now spanned state lines and decades of systemic cover-ups. Some had led the attacks, others had kept the doors open, but no one walked away. Talbot was the last. He'd tried to run, disappeared from his apartment just hours after the funeral incident exploded online. But the digital footprint left behind was sloppy. A burner phone pinged twice in the wrong quadrant of the city. His car was found near the port of Houston, abandoned. He was spotted on foot near a truck yard, trying to board an outbound rig. They caught him at the gates, surrounded by agents with rifles drawn. No camera this time. "Huh," he snarled, cuffed on the hood of a Ford truck. "No viral moment, just gonna drag me out like a dog." Reed stood over him, calm as ever. "That was your mistake. You thought the only justice that mattered was the kind that made headlines. But this is from the steps of the FBI field office." Reed gave his first public statement just before 8 a.m. "We have completed a coordinated operation targeting individuals responsible for systemic abuses within Houston's law enforcement community. These actions were not isolated. They were structured, protected, and weaponized against citizens, particularly black military veterans and their families. Today marks the first step toward dismantling that structure." He didn't say Dana Mitchell's name. He didn't have to. The public already knew. Her face, her voice, Her restraint under violence had become a symbol of both pain and perseverance. Veterans across the country saluted her image as it played on loop across news stations. Families in living rooms whispered her name with reverence. Inside a holding cell beneath federal custody, Granger sat with his hands clasped together, no longer in control. He had refused food, refused water. He stared at the metal wall across from him like he could change it. But what he didn't know was that the system he had once controlled was crumbling from within. Dana's recording, her calm extraction of his own words, had been authenticated and transmitted directly to the Department of Justice. The voice memo containing his quiet admission of coordinating Drew's reassignment had triggered more than arrests. It had ignited a firestorm in Washington. Senator McConnell's name was on the wiretap, too. And though he hadn't been arrested, he had moved quickly, faster than anyone expected. The networks that had empowered Granger weren't gone. They were regrouping, shifting, calculating their next steps. Because for the powerful, even when one gate falls, others remain. But so do those who remember the names written behind them. And as the sun rose higher over Houston, the city knew the reckoning had begun. But the war for truth was far from over. Next, Dana Mitchell would face the man who wrote the orders in ink no one was supposed to see. And this time, the whole world would be watching. Under the blinding fluorescence of the campaign headquarters, the room was a flurry of keystrokes, buzzwords, and panic dressed as precision. Senator Jack McConnell stood at the head of a long, polished walnut table, his tailored suit perfectly creased, his expression hard enough to split granite. He wasn't shouting. McConnell didn't need volume. He had gravity, the kind that pulled the spineless into orbit and crushed the principled into silence. What lay before him wasn't policy. It was a war board. Flat screens on the wall looped clips from cable news. One showed General Dana Mitchell being led in cuffs. Another zoomed in on the face of a once untouchable police chief, now booking into federal custody. Headlines scrolled like open wounds. Houston Police Network exposed. Military hero reveals gatekeeper's conspiracy. FBI raid shakes Texas law enforcement. And beneath it all, a rising tide of public support for Dana. Hashtag after hashtag, rallies in the state capitals, even calls for a federal review. McConnell tapped his fingers in slow, deliberate rhythm. "We have a situation," he said, echoing words once spoken in a hidden room above a bar now sealed off by federal agents. The communications director, a nervous man in his 30s named Kevin Dawes, adjusted his tie and cleared his throat. "The narrative's slipping, sir. We underestimated the veteran response. The arrest backfired. Mitchell's approval is climbing across party lines. Even moderate Republicans are posting tributes." McConnell didn't flinch. "Then give them something else to talk about." Silence settled. Then came the slow unspooling of strategy, the real campaign. Not the one built on debates and town halls, but the one carved from whispers, manufactured footage, and headlines tailored for outrage. "Start with mental instability," McConnell said, his voice flat. "Dig into her early years, military psych evaluations, find someone willing to say she exhibited command volatility. If they won't, pay them." A young woman in the corner of the room typed frantically, logging every instruction into a task spreadsheet with all the warmth of a stenographer at a war tribunal. "We have a dated memo from a 2003 overseas mission," she said. A subordinate filed a complaint. It was dismissed, but we can leak the original draft. "Good," McConnell replied. "Then build the arc, emotional trauma, overextension, erratic decisions in the field. tie it to her son's death suggest survivor's guilt. Projection. Paint her as unstable. Another aide chimed in, this one from the digital media team. We can push it through surrogate accounts, influencers in the veteran community who've worked with us before. Give them the what if she snapped angle. Run it hard across TikTok, Reels, anything that hits fast and emotional. Make sure the right-wing outlets have a copy by morning. McConnell added, if we say it loud enough, it doesn't have to be true. It just has to be confusing. The legal advisor, a man who wore his Harvard law ring like a shield, finally spoke. Sir, we're towing the line on defamation. If any of this is traced back, it won't be. McConnell cut in. That's what layers are for. If she sues, she looks vengeful. If she stays quiet, she looks guilty. Either way, we muddy the waters. The screens shifted again, this time showing Dana's speech at the funeral. Her voice was calm. Her stance was unshaken. The letter from Drew was still in her hand. It had gone viral in every language. In countries McConnell couldn't pronounce. They're calling her the conscience of the military. Someone mumbled. McConnell smiled thin, surgical. Then let's make conscience look like madness. Outside, the night deepened, and the press offices began preparing their headlines for the next day. Emails would be leaked. Threads would unravel. Conservative talk shows would open with phrases like alarming new questions and unfit to lead. Carefully worded op-eds would compare Dana's tactics to military insubordination, suggest paranoia, hint at PTSD. One anchor was already on standby to say, her service is commendable, but so was Benedict Arnold's. And just like that, the smear offensive was underway. It wasn't just about stopping Dana. It was about rewriting her, hollowing out her image from the inside, turning truth into theory, credibility into controversy, morality into mental illness. And in the middle of it all, McConnell stood unmoved by justice, by grief, by consequence. But what he didn't know, what none of them saw coming, was that silence in the enemy's ranks is not always surrender. Sometimes it's preparation. Because not far from that fluorescent-lit room, a man once called the architect of McConnell's political machine, his strategist, fixer, enforcer, was watching the headlines with a hand trembling. Above a phone, and for the first time in his career, he wasn't protecting power. He was about to expose it. Under the sterile glare of fluorescent lights, the FBI interrogation room felt less like a space for justice and more like a quiet reckoning. Agent Marcus Reed sat across from Officer Liam Brooks, his expression unreadable, arms folded with intent. Erin Mitchell sat beside him, hands clasped tightly, her stillness the only thing containing the fury just beneath her skin. Across the table, Brooks looked smaller than his legacy, his silver hair limp, his face marked by years of complicity. Once a high-ranking gatekeeper, he had coordinated the silent machinery that moved inconvenient black officers into danger or obscurity. He had never spoken about it. Until tonight, Erin was the first to speak. You asked for this meeting. We're listening. Brooks didn't meet her eyes. I never signed up for murder, he said. Not kids, not like this. He reached into his worn leather satchel and slid a flash drive across the table. This was recorded at a closed-door session last April. No press. No phones, just us and McConnell. Reed inserted the drive into a secured tablet. The speakers crackled, then came to life with the soft clinking of glasses and laughter. Then a voice calm, polished, unmistakable. Gentlemen, said Senator Jack McConnell, we've got a discipline issue. young, black, decorated, speaks too well. That kind of soldier disrupts the chain. A brief pause, then quieter and colder. Captain Drew Mitchell. If we let him rise, we lose the narrative, so we sent him out. Bad intel, rough terrain. Let the desert clean up the mess. We don't need a martyr, we need a message. The audio clicked off. Silence filled the room like smoke. Reed leaned back, jaw tight. Aaron stared straight ahead, knuckles white. Brooks closed his eyes. "You've had this for a year," Reed asked. Brooks nodded, didn't trust anyone. Then, last month, my daughter, she's 10, asked me why the black kids don't come home from war. His voice cracked. I couldn't lie to her anymore. He looked up. This isn't about clearing my name. It's about giving her a future where that question doesn't need asking. Reed moved to the observation window and signaled the agents beyond it. Everything they needed: Chen's files, Dana's audio, and now this was finally in place. "You're going on record?" Reed asked. "Full deposition," Brooks said. "Under oath." Aaron's voice was quiet but firm. "You helped build a machine that buried my brother. But today, you broke the silence. That matters." Brooks didn't smile. "It should have broken long ago." 2 agents entered. They didn't cuff him. He wasn't under arrest. He was surrendering something heavier than chains: his silence. After he was escorted out, Reed looked at Aaron. "We take this public. Tomorrow, prime time." Aaron nodded. "Let's give Drew the truth they tried to erase." And as they gathered the files, as the truth began to take its final shape, across the city, a campaign rally was already underway. Jack McConnell stood beneath the lights, smiling, hands raised to thunderous applause. He had no idea that the voice that once condemned a soldier was about to be heard by a nation. Under the vaulted lights of the Dallas Convention Center, the air throbbed with anticipation. 1,000 supporters stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces illuminated by the stage's gleaming LED backdrop, each breath syncing with the rhythmic thump of patriotic music echoing through the vast hall. American flags flanked the stage, their stars and stripes pristine and deliberate, placed to remind the world watching that this man, the man who now stepped behind the podium, was the embodiment of power, continuity, and legacy. Senator Jack McConnell raised his arms in a practiced gesture, the kind that evoked applause on cue, and they delivered. The crowd erupted with cheers, some chanting his name, others waving signs that bore words like order, honor, truth. But the only truth in that room had yet to be spoken. McConnell's jaw tightened just slightly before he leaned into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, his voice warm but calculated. "We stand today not just for an election. We stand for the soul of this country." He paced, hands steepled at his chest. "They say we've lost our way, that we've turned on each other, but I say no. I say we've been tested. And now, it's our time to take this country back." The cheers climbed again, a wave of devotion rising around him. Cameras swept across the sea of red, white, and blue. Networks carried it live, coast to coast. But backstage, behind the layers of security, something else moved in silence. Agent Marcus Reed stood by the service corridor, earpiece in, voice low as he murmured into the mic clipped beneath his collar. All teams in position across the venue. Agents began to move. No sirens, no warning. This wasn't a raid. It was a reckoning wrapped in discipline. Reed nodded once, eyes cold with purpose. "Execute on my mark." Back on stage, McConnell continued, now leaning into outrage. "They say we're racist, that we're corrupt. But who are they? people who don't know what real sacrifice looks like, people who never fought for this flag. I say we remember who we are. As the words echoed, Dana Mitchell stood quietly near the press risers. She wasn't scheduled to speak, wasn't even expected, but her presence felt like pressure in the room, the kind that precedes thunder. And then, just as McConnell lifted his hands again to call the crowd into one final crescendo, the sound changed. A subtle shift, a low hum through the audio feed, like interference. A few members of the audience frowned. McConnell paused, blinking toward the sound booth. "Can we fix that, please?" he asked, slightly off mic, but the hum didn't stop. It sharpened, clarified, and then, through every speaker in the building, a voice began to play. Not McConnell's public voice, the one shaped for cameras. No, this was his private voice, ragged, direct, recorded without his knowledge. "Make sure that soldier doesn't return home breathing." The crowd froze. Some gasped. Others glanced around, unsure if what they heard was real, but the voice continued. "I don't care what strings you have to pull. Mitchell's kid is a problem. These men coming back from war, thinking they have a say in how we run this state. Put 'em out there. Let the desert solve it for us." McConnell's face drained of color. He reached for the microphone, tried to cut it off, but the system wasn't his anymore. Reed had already taken control. More agents moved in from the wings. "That's enough," McConnell shouted. "This is doctored. This is political warfare." But no one moved to applaud. No one rose to defend him. The crowd that had once roared was now silent. Cold, Reed stepped into the spotlight from stage left, followed by 3 agents. The badge around his neck glinted. "Senator Jack McConnell," he said, his voice reverberating through the now hijacked speakers. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and directing unlawful military targeting of U personnel." Gasps rolled through the hall. McConnell staggered back, one hand on the podium. "You can't do this," he hissed. "This is a campaign event." "No." Dana's voice rang out from the front row, cutting through the tension like a blade. "This is a crime scene." The agents reached McConnell. He resisted only for a second, trying to wave down a staffer, but there was nowhere to run. Cameras followed every step as he was handcuffed, hands behind his back, microphone still hot as it picked up the snap of steel. "You're making a mistake," he growled. "You'll regret this." Dana stepped forward, not to gloat, not to revel, but to witness. Because that moment, the fall of the man who engineered her son's death was not about vengeance. It was about memory, about a truth that had clawed its way to the surface despite every effort to bury it. As McConnell was led off the stage, the feed was still live. Millions watched. Some cried, others cheered, but all of them saw it. A man, once untouchable, dragged into the same system he had corrupted for years, and at the foot of the stage, Dana stood motionless, unblinking. Her face was not one of triumph, but of mourning fulfilled. Reporters swarmed the scene. Headlines were already flashing across screens. "Senator arrested in live broadcast. Recording exposes military targeting scandal. General Mitchell's case opens national inquiry." And beneath it all, a new tone began to emerge, not of scandal, but of reform, of reckoning, of a system forced to look itself in the mirror. Later that night, in the quiet corridors of the Capitol, a decision was made. The House Oversight Committee would open emergency hearings on systemic abuse within the military and law enforcement. And the first person summoned to testify, the woman who refused to be broken. even when they put a gun to her head, was General Dana Mitchell. Because justice wasn't just about who fell, it was about who stood up afterward. Capitol Hill was not built for silence, but the room fell into it the moment General Dana Mitchell took her seat. The chamber was packed rows of representatives, civil rights advocates, legal scholars, retired military officers, and dozens of cameras all trained forward. Every seat was filled, every microphone on, but no one moved, no one spoke. It was the kind of hush reserved not for reverence, but for reckoning. She wore her dress uniform again, not because she needed the validation of brass or cloth, but because it was hers, earned, each ribbon stitched with memory, each medal pinned with consequence. 30 years of service had carried her across deserts, through jungles, into war zones so volatile that names had been redacted from history books. But today, she wasn't here as a warrior. She was here as a witness. Chairwoman Langley, a veteran of civil rights battles stretching back to the 80s, adjusted her glasses and nodded slightly. "General Mitchell," she said, "the floor is yours." Dana didn't read from notes. She didn't glance at a script. Her voice came steady, deliberate, low like a distant storm preparing to break. "I buried my son twice," she began. "Once beneath the weight of a flag I had defended my entire life, and once beneath the lies told to protect the people who orchestrated his death." She paused. Not for drama, for breath, for space, for dignity. Captain Drew Mitchell was killed in what they called an unfortunate deployment error. I believed that at first, wanted to, because the alternative meant accepting that men in uniform, men sworn to the same code I lived by, had sent him into danger not to protect the mission, but to silence him. Gasps were quiet, but they rippled like shivers through the rows. For months, she continued, my son investigated a network known as the Gatekeepers, a covert group embedded within law enforcement, military command, and civil institutions. Their mission was to identify black military personnel who were viewed as disruptive, uncontrollable, principled, and then reposition them, punish them, erase them. A senator leaned forward. "And you have proof." Dana turned toward the screen already positioned behind her. With a nod, she signaled to the clerk to begin playback. The audio was grainy, but unmistakable. It was the voice of former Senator Jack McConnell, cold, direct, caught on tape months earlier. "Make sure that the soldier doesn't return home breathing. We need an example." Several senators flinched. Others went pale. The room shifted again, not just in tone, but in weight. This was no longer about allegations. It was about accountability. Dana looked directly at them. "That order led to my son's death. It led to my arrest at his funeral. It led to a moment in this country where the highest-ranking black female general in U.S. history was held at gunpoint by her own police department in front of national cameras while honoring her fallen child. She didn't yell. She didn't tremble. She let the truth land like a stone dropped in still water. The system that allowed that to happen is not broken. It is functioning exactly as designed. That's what my son wanted to expose, and that's what they killed him for." Senator Ruben Garcia, himself a former Army Ranger, cleared his throat. "General Mitchell, were you aware that internal efforts were made to label you as unstable, that sealed files were nearly leaked claiming you had been relieved of command overseas?" Dana nodded. "Yes, it's a familiar tactic. When they cannot silence you through violence, they try discrediting your voice. A lie repeated enough becomes an alibi." But I kept the records, I kept the orders, and I have never, in my career, failed a command, not once. The only thing I failed to do was see what was coming for my son. A beat of silence. No one interrupted. Even the journalist stopped typing. She leaned slightly forward. My son was not alone. I am not alone. There are hundreds, maybe thousands of names that deserve to be read into this record. Lives interrupted, careers destroyed, sacrifices erased, and we will not be quiet anymore. Erin sat just behind her mother, hands folded tightly in her lap, a soft expression of awe and ache on her face. She had seen Dana at her worst, bruised in a jail cell, dragged through mud by the media, pushed against gravestones by men with guns, but this was her mother standing in full. Dana's eyes swept the room. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm demanding change. Legislative oversight, federal review boards, independent prosecutorial authority for cases involving minority veterans. These aren't just policies. They're safeguards against another Drew, against another funeral that turns into a crime scene. Chairwoman Langley looked at her colleagues, then back to Dana. Do you have anything else to add? Dana's gaze sharpened. Her voice dropped just above a whisper. Yes, I may have worn this uniform for 30 years, but today I speak as a mother. If this country can't protect the children who protect it, then what are we? No one answered. They didn't need to. As she stepped back from the podium, the chamber remained silent. But it wasn't the silence of dismissal. It was the silence of something shifting, something opening. Outside, the press scrambled to reframe the story. Live feeds replayed her every word. Social media exploded with tags, reposts, and rallying cries. Dana's name trended in all 50 states within the hour. Not for scandal, not for arrest, but for truth. And back in Houston, arrangements were quietly being made. Erin was already coordinating with veterans groups, civil rights leaders, and military officials, because in 1 year's time, there would be another ceremony, but this time no one would try to move the grave. This time there would be no fences, no segregated rows, no snipers behind trees, just a flag, a name, and the sound of a nation finally learning how to listen. The funeral, revisited not as a battleground, but as a promise kept. Under a sky brushed with the lightest shades of gold, Arlington Heights. Cemetery stood as it always had, disciplined, solemn, and carved into the history of a nation that often forgot the cost of its own promises. Rows of white marble stretched across the green like silent sentinels, and at the heart of it all, a new marker stood freshly placed, polished to gleam in the morning sun. This time, no confusion clouded the ceremony. No whispered disputes about burial sections or silent orders to isolate the grieving. This time, the nation knew exactly who lay beneath the soil and why it mattered. A year had passed since Captain Drew Mitchell was first lowered into the ground beneath a manufactured fog of dishonor and threat. A year of investigations, trials, testimony, and reckoning. And now, there would be no footnote, there would be no erasure. Because today, he was remembered not just as a soldier, but as the spark that set an entire system alight. General Dana Mitchell stood at the center, her posture unshakable in full 4-star regalia, her hair, once pulled back in the tight bun of a battlefield commander, now moved freely in the light breeze. The crowd before her stretched farther than the eye could follow, veterans, families, activists, lawmakers, and strangers who had once only known her story through screens, but now showed up to stand beside her. Erin stood nearby, her fingers brushing the folded flag clenched tightly to her chest, not a symbol of loss anymore, but one of reclamation. On her lapel, a pin gleamed with the newly inscribed seal of the Drew Mitchell Military Justice Act legislation, drafted, signed, and passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. It was the law now no veteran's reassignment could be made without full review. No targeting of personnel based on background would go unchallenged, and internal watchdogs would be placed across state and federal agencies to monitor abuses of authority. And it bore his name, Drew Mitchell, not as a warning, but as a line in the sand. At the far edge of the ceremony, Agent Marcus Reed stood beside Officer Jason Chen, who still bore a subtle limp and a scar over his brow but stood straighter than anyone had seen him in months. The two men had spent the better part of the past year navigating courtrooms, shredding lies, and holding doors open for witnesses who'd long been too afraid to speak. Chen had nearly died getting the first recordings out. Now he stood in uniform, recognized publicly for his role in the investigation, and awarded the Civil Valor Citation by the Department of Justice just days earlier. Across the lawn, soldiers stood in perfect formation, ready to deliver a salute not just to a fallen comrade, but to a chapter of history too long delayed. And beside them, hundreds of veterans stood of their own accord, black, white, brown, young, and gray, linked not by rank or campaign but by resolve. Among the guests sat families whose stories never made headlines, who had buried sons and daughters in silence, whose pain had only been given language because one mother refused to bow. Dana stepped forward. There was no podium, no teleprompter, just her voice. 1 year ago, I stood at this ground and was told my son couldn't rest here, that this space, this soil, this honor was not for him, that his sacrifice came with a condition, that his skin, his lineage, his leadership made him unworthy. The crowd stood frozen in quiet witness. They were wrong. Her voice did not tremble. He was worthy. Every inch of him, every step he took into danger, every report he filed, every soldier he shielded, every truth he uncovered, even when it cost him everything. She held out a small wooden box inside Drew's final service medal. She knelt slowly, placing it at the foot of the headstone. Captain Drew Mitchell did not die for a lie. He died exposing one. And because he did, this country is different today. She rose because of him. There are rules now because of him. There are names we will remember, and because of him. The next black soldier who rises through the ranks won't be seen as a threat but as a promise kept. The silence swelled into applause, not loud, not explosive, but reverent, grounded. And then, as if on cue, the honor guard raised their rifles. 3 volleys cracked through the still air. The bugle followed, taps played with aching clarity, each note trailing like a farewell that didn't break, but lifted. A folded flag was passed, a final salute was rendered, and Drew Mitchell, this time, was buried not in silence but in recognition. But not everyone had come to pay respect. At the edge of the crowd, mostly unseen by the cameras, stood a man in a crisp, dark suit, hands clasped in front of him, expression unreadable. Senator Jack McConnell. Out on conditional release while awaiting trial. No press surrounded him, no aides, just the weight of his own unraveling legacy. He watched the ceremony from a distance, as if proximity might still infect him with dignity he had long discarded. Erin saw him first. Her jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Dana noticed too, but her eyes didn't narrow. She didn't grant him that space in her anger. She simply turned her gaze back toward her son's grave. And then she did something no one expected. She walked past the rows of mourners, past the saluting officers, past the stone paths carved into the land like arteries. She stopped just 10 feet from McConnell. He didn't speak. Neither did she. She just looked at him, and in her eyes there was no rage. There was something colder, more permanent, the knowing, the truth that no title, no speech, no wealth could armor a man from what the world now knew, and she nodded, not a gesture of respect but of closure. She had won. Not just the fight, but the memory. She turned and walked away, and behind her, the shadow of a man who once believed himself untouchable shrank with every step she took. Drew Mitchell's grave no longer marked a tragedy, it marked a turning point, and just beyond the cemetery gates, something else stirred something the nation hadn't seen yet. A courtroom prepared, a jury was summoned, and a final reckoning yet to unfold, because the dead had been honored, but the living still had to answer. The cemetery was quiet in the way only sacred ground can be where grief doesn't speak. It settles, deep and still like fog on polished stone. Rows of military uniforms line the edge of Arlington Heights once more. Though, this time, the air didn't carry the shame of erasure. It carried weight, recognition, and reckoning. Dana stood at the head of the service, not just as a mother mourning a son, but as a general who had turned pain into policy, silence into sound, and grief into ground truth. A new plaque now sat embedded at the foot of Drew Mitchell's grave, not just his name, not just his rank, but a line beneath that read, "His courage exposed what power tried to hide." The ceremony was beautiful. Full military honors, bugles, folded flags, and this time, no one interrupted her, no one dared. But as the final notes of taps faded into the breeze, a figure approached, uninvited, unbowed, Senator Jack McConnell. No longer the confident orchestrator of campaigns and cover-ups, but still a man draped in just enough political insulation to remain out of prison for now. His eyes scanned the crowd for reaction, but none came. Not from the veterans, not from the families. Only Dana turned, stepping forward slowly until they stood a breath apart. Cameras pivoted. Reporters leaned in. McConnell extended his hand, palm up, rehearsed in artificial grace. "For the sake of unity," he said smoothly, as if history could be negotiated. Dana didn't take it. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small black device compact, military grade, with one button glowing red. Her voice was calm, clear, lethal. "You remember the barracks at Camp Trask McConnell's." A smile faltered. She pressed the button, static cracked, then cleared, and then his voice. Not edited, not distorted. The original conversation, recorded by Drew's team 1 month before his death. "Move Mitchell's unit. Remote valley. Get it done quietly. If he doesn't come back breathing, so be it. We need an example. You want order, you make sure they know what happens when one of them steps out of line." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The color drained from McConnell's face. Before he could respond, the crunch of boots sounded behind him. Military police, full uniform, arrest warrant in hand. The same hands that once twisted policy into weapons now shook as they gripped steel. "Jack McConnell," the lead officer said, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, abuse of military authority, and high treason." McConnell's mouth opened. No words came, only silence, the same silence he'd relied on to protect his empire. Now, it swallowed him. Dana didn't blink. "You didn't just try to end a career," she said, her voice steady. "You ended a life." As McConnell was led away in cuffs, past the graves he thought would never speak, Dana turned back to her son's headstone. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The nation was already listening. Within days, federal indictments spread like fire. Across 5 states, investigations linked to McConnell's gatekeeper network detonated into public view. Police departments, court clerks, military offices, dozens of officials were suspended or resigned. Congressional hearings were reopened. Whistleblowers poured forward, many who'd been waiting years for a signal that it was safe to speak. The system that once seemed too dense to pierce now cracked from the inside out. Granger faced a second wave of charges of obstruction, racketeering, witness intimidation. His trial aired nightly, and while his lawyers argued procedural technicalities, Americans tuned in not for the legalese, but for what had already changed outside the courtroom. The Pentagon announced a new directive, mandatory anti-discrimination audits across all branches. Internal affairs teams were federalized in key precincts. And the Drew Mitchell Military Justice Act, already signed into law, triggered the largest overhaul of military complaint reporting since the Vietnam era. In city after city, people held vigils not just for Drew, but for those like him. Quiet soldiers, forgotten voices, buried names. A billboard rose in Atlanta. They thought they buried him, but they were planting something. In Houston, the 3rd Ward repaved the street outside Dana's childhood home and renamed it Mitchell Way. The mayor's office declared March 4th, Drew's birthday, a citywide day of integrity. But even in victory, Dana knew the machine hadn't vanished. It had recoiled, regrouped, prepared for its next evolution. That's what power does. So she did the only thing that made sense. She built something stronger. In a modest brownstone near the Capitol, sunlight streamed through tall windows where the words "The Drew Mitchell Foundation for Military Equity" were etched in glass. Side. Walls were lined not with portraits of generals, but testimonies, letters from families, files from whistleblowers, and signed pledges from units vowing to uphold what bureaucracy had failed to protect. Dana sat at the head of a wide oak table. Across from her, Aaron reviewed legal documents. The law journal she co-authored now used in military ethics training nationwide. Jason Chen, a scar on his jaw still visible, now wore a badge that read Chief Investigator, Internal Oversight Division. And Agent Marcus Reed, the man who once followed breadcrumbs in the dark, now served as liaison between the Justice Department and every reform bill with Dana's signature on it. Their mission was simple: protect those who speak up, defend those targeted for doing what's right, expose those who manipulate power to bury truth. Dana leaned back slightly, watching a group of young cadets tour the office's memorial wall. One of them stopped at Drew's plaque. His fingers traced the engraved line. He saw what others ignored. He stood when others stayed silent. The boy turned to her. "Ma'am," he said, "I want to make sure I never become one of the quiet ones." Dana nodded. "Then you're already on the right path." Later that afternoon, she returned to Arlington. No cameras, no reporters, just a mother, just the wind. She stood by Drew's grave, her hand resting on the cool stone. Leaves whispered through the trees above. Her voice was low, meant for him alone. "They silenced you to protect their power," she said. "But now, your voice rewrites history." She knelt, not in grief but in reverence. "You're gone, but what you started, it's only begun." And for the first time in a long time, Dana Mitchell allowed herself something she rarely had the luxury to feel peace. Not because justice was complete, but because it had, finally, begun. Justice isn't always loud. It starts with one voice refusing silence. Dana Mitchell didn't just fight for her son. She fought to unearth a system built on fear and helped rebuild it on truth. This story reminds us real change begins when we choose to see, to speak, and to act. Would you have stood with her? Let us know in the comments. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful voices that deserve to be heard.